The banging on the door started just after midnight, and Grace knew at once that something was wrong. She sat up in bed, her heart hammering, and listened. There it was again. 3 hard knocks, then silence, then a voice she did not recognize, low and rough, speaking to someone else outside her small cottage. She could not make out the words, but she understood the tone. It was not a friendly visit. Grace slipped out of bed and moved to the window, careful not to let the old floorboards creak beneath her feet. Through the gap in the curtain, she saw torches. 4 of them, maybe 5, held by men in dark cloaks, standing at the edge of her small garden. One man stood at her door, his fist raised to knock again. She had lived in this village her whole life. 19 years in the same 3 rooms, with the same leaking roof and the same view of the wheat fields beyond the fence. Nobody in Ashbourne ever came to her door with torches in the middle of the night. Nobody in Ashbourne had any reason to. The knock came a 3rd time, harder now, and a voice called out, "Open this door. We know a woman lives here. We only wish to ask her questions." Questions. That word alone made Grace's skin turn cold. She had spent her whole life being told, gently but firmly, never to answer questions about her mother. Not from the priest, not from the tax collector, not even from kind old women at the market who meant no harm by asking. Her guardian, a woman named Agnes who had raised her since she was a baby, had drilled this lesson into her from the time she could speak. If anyone asks about your mother, you say she died of fever, and you remember nothing. That is the whole truth you are allowed to know. Grace had never questioned it as a child. It was simply how things were, the way the sky was blue and the river ran east. But standing at the window now, watching torchlight flicker against her garden fence, she understood for the first time that this had never been an ordinary family secret. It was something else, something that made men march to her door at midnight with weapons at their belts. She crossed the small room to where Agnes slept, only to find the bed already empty, the blanket thrown back. A cold draft came from the kitchen. Grace hurried through and found the back door open, swinging gently on its hinge, and Agnes nowhere in sight. For one terrible moment, Grace thought the old woman had abandoned her. Then she saw the folded cloth on the kitchen table, weighed down by a small brass key she had never seen before. Beside it lay a single word scrawled in charcoal: "Run." The front door shuddered under a heavier blow, wood groaning against its frame. Grace did not stop to think. She grabbed her shawl from its hook, snatched the key and the cloth from the table, and slipped out through the back door into the night. The air outside was sharp and cold, and the moon hung low over the wheat fields, throwing long silver light across the open ground. She knew this land better than any of the men chasing her ever could. She had run through these fields as a child chasing rabbits, had hidden in the old grain store during games with the village children, had walked the riverbank so many times she could have found her way blind. Behind her, she heard the front door finally give way, wood splintering, and a man's voice shouting orders. She did not look back. She ran low along the fence line, keeping to the shadows, her bare feet stinging against the cold stubble of the harvested field. She reached the tree line at the edge of the hollow wood, just as a horn sounded behind her, sharp and urgent, calling more men toward the cottage. Grace pressed herself against the trunk of an old oak and forced herself to breathe slowly, quietly, the way Agnes had once taught her when they used to play hiding games in this very wood. Except this was no game. Through the gaps in the trees, she watched lantern light spread across her home like a slow flood. Men moved through her garden, through her kitchen, through the small bedroom where she had slept every night of her life. She heard furniture being overturned. She heard a voice, clearer now, calling out to the others. "She is not here. Search the wood. She could not have gone far." Grace's stomach twisted. They were not simply looking for a thief or a runaway debtor. This was organized, deliberate. These men had come prepared, with torches and horns, and enough numbers to surround a small cottage in the middle of the night, all for one young woman who had never left her own village more than a day's walk in her life. She pressed the folded cloth against her chest, and finally allowed herself to look at it properly, tilting it toward a thin shaft of moonlight breaking through the branches above. Sewn into the fabric, in careful, faded stitching, was a name she did not recognize. Elowen. Beneath the name was a single date, more than 19 years old, Grace's own birth year. Her breath caught. Elowen, not Grace, the name her mother had given her, perhaps, before Agnes ever called her anything else. She turned the cloth over in her trembling hands and found more stitching on the reverse side, smaller, harder to read in the dim light. A single word. Edmund, the name of the old king. Grace had heard it spoken all her life, in prayers at the village chapel, in stories told by traveling merchants, in the formal proclamations read aloud in the square whenever new laws came from the capital. King Edmund had ruled the land for nearly 30 years before his death, almost 2 years past. Everyone knew his name. Nobody in Ashbourne had ever thought to connect it to a poor seamstress's daughter hiding in the hollow wood. A branch snapped somewhere behind her, and Grace froze, pressing herself flatter against the oak. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, a lantern swinging with each step. She held her breath as the light passed within a few paces of her hiding place, close enough that she could see the polished buckles on the man's boots, close enough to smell the oil from his lantern. He paused. Grace's heart pounded so loudly she feared he might hear it. Then, after a moment that felt like an eternity, he moved on, calling out to a companion further along the tree line. When the light had faded enough, Grace allowed herself to breathe again. She could not stay in the wood. The men would search every tree, every hollow, every ditch, before the night was through. She needed to move, and she needed a plan, and she had neither. She thought of Agnes. Where had the old woman gone? Had she run ahead, hoping to draw the searchers away? Had she been caught before Grace even woke? The thought made her chest tighten with fear, but she forced herself to push it aside. Agnes had survived far worse than this, in ways Grace had never fully understood until tonight. If anyone could vanish into the darkness and reappear safely on the other side, it was her. Grace moved deeper into the wood, away from the direction the searchers had come, following the faint sound of running water that she knew led toward the river. If she could reach the river, she could follow it south, away from the village, away from the men and their torches, toward the market town of Redmore, where she might find a place to hide until morning. The going was slow and painful. Roots and stones bit into her bare feet, and thin branches scratched at her arms and face as she pushed through the undergrowth. Twice more she heard voices in the distance, and twice more she froze until the sound faded. By the time she reached the riverbank, her legs were trembling with exhaustion, and her hands were raw from gripping branches to keep her balance on the slope. The river ran wide and dark under the moonlight, its surface rippling silver. Grace crouched at the water's edge and allowed herself a moment to catch her breath, glancing back toward the wood behind her. No torches, no voices. For now, it seemed, she had outrun them. She unfolded the cloth again and studied it more closely. Beneath the names, she noticed something she had missed before. A small symbol stitched into the corner, a crown, simple in design, with 3 points instead of the usual 5. She had seen that symbol before, though it took her a moment to remember where. It was stamped on the old coins that occasionally passed through the village market, coins minted during King Edmund's early reign, before the design had changed. Her mother had sewn a royal symbol into a piece of cloth and hidden it away for 19 years. Her mother had given her a name that was not the name Grace had grown up with. Her mother, whoever she truly was, had known something so dangerous that men still came looking for it, or for her daughter, even after the king himself was 2 years in his grave. A twig snapped somewhere behind her, and this time, Grace did not wait to see who it was. She slipped into the shallow water at the river's edge, wincing at the cold, and began to wade along the bank, staying low, using the darkness and the tall reeds to hide her movement. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the slope she had just descended, and a voice calling out to the others. Down here. Someone has been through here recently. Grace's blood turned to ice. She pushed deeper into the reeds, the cold water now reaching her waist, and forced herself to move as silently as she could manage, each step a careful, deliberate placement of her foot against the unseen riverbed. Behind her, lantern light swept across the water's surface, searching, and she ducked lower, submerging herself to the shoulders, holding perfectly still as the light passed over the reeds where she hid. Nothing here, Whitesar, the voice finally said, disappointed. She may have doubled back toward the road. The footsteps retreated, and Grace allowed herself to exhale, slow and shaking, the cold water numbing her limbs. She waited until she could no longer hear any sound of pursuit, before she finally rose from the reeds, dripping and shivering, and continued her slow journey along the riverbank. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, painting the horizon in pale gray and gold, Grace finally allowed herself to stop, tucked into a small hollow beneath an overhanging bank, where the roots of an old willow tree formed a natural shelter. She was exhausted, cold, and frightened in a way she had never known before, but she was alive, and she was still free. She looked down at the cloth in her hands, now damp from the river, the stitched names slightly smudged but still legible. Elowyn, Edmund, a crown with 3 points. Whoever she truly was, Grace understood now that her old life in Ashbourne was gone forever. The cottage with the leaking roof, the quiet days at the market, the simple comfort of being nobody in particular, all of it belonged to a version of herself that no longer existed. Somewhere out there, powerful men had decided that her very existence was a danger worth chasing through the night with torches and blades. She did not yet understand why, but she intended to find out, and she intended to survive long enough to do it. In the distance, faint against the brightening sky, she heard the sound of a horn once more, calling searchers back toward the road. They had not given up. They would not give up, not for a single night, not for a single failed search. Whatever secret her blood carried, it was worth enough to someone that they would spend every resource at their command to silence her before she ever understood what she knew. Grace closed her eyes for just a moment, feeling the cold morning air against her damp skin, and made herself a quiet promise. She would find Agnes. She would learn the truth about her mother, about the name Elowyn, about the crown stitched into that cloth, and she would not let them find her first. Somewhere behind her, in the ruins of her old life, a search that had begun with a handful of men at her cottage door was already growing into something far larger, something that would soon spread across every road, every village, and every corner of the kingdom she called home. But Grace did not know that yet. For now, all she knew was that she had survived one night, and that survival, for the first time in her life, felt like the only thing that mattered. She rose from her hiding place as the sun broke fully over the horizon, wrapped the damp cloth carefully inside her shawl, and began walking south, toward Redmore, toward answers, and toward a truth that would change everything she had ever believed about who she was. The road to Redmore followed the river for most of its length, and Grace kept close to the water, ducking into the tall grass whenever she heard the sound of hooves or wheels approaching from either direction. Farmers heading to market passed her twice, their carts loaded with sacks of grain, but neither gave her more than a passing glance. A barefoot young woman walking along a riverside path was not an unusual sight in the early hours, and for that small mercy, Grace was grateful. By mid-morning, hunger had begun to gnaw at her stomach, sharp and insistent, reminding her that she had eaten nothing since the previous evening. She had no coin, no food, and nothing but the damp cloth and the clothes on her back. She thought briefly of turning toward one of the farms she passed, of asking for work in exchange for a meal, but the memory of torches at her door kept her moving instead, unwilling to risk drawing attention to herself in any way. It was near midday when she first noticed the girl watching her from across a low stone wall bordering an orchard. She could not have been more than 12 years old, with dark curls escaping from beneath a woolen cap, and she held a basket of apples against her hip as she stared at Grace with open curiosity. "You look like you have walked all night," the girl said, her voice matter-of-fact rather than unkind. Grace hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but exhaustion and hunger loosened her caution more than she intended. "I have," she admitted. "I do not suppose you would part with an apple or two, in exchange for nothing but my thanks. I have no coin to offer." The girl studied her for a long moment, then glanced back toward a farmhouse visible through the trees, its chimney sending a thin trail of smoke into the pale sky. "My mother says never to give strangers something for nothing," she said, "but she also says a person ought never turn away someone who looks like they have run from trouble." She held out 2 apples over the wall. "You look like you have run from trouble." Grace took the apples gratefully, murmuring her thanks, and the girl lingered a moment longer, her curiosity clearly not yet satisfied. "Are you going to Redmore?" the girl asked. There were riders through here at dawn, asking after a young woman traveling alone. They said she might come this way. Grace's chest tightened, the apple suddenly forgotten in her hand. What did they look like, these riders? Grim, the girl said simply, not like the king's usual men. My father said they wore no proper colors, no crest he recognized, only black cloaks and iron badges shaped like a wolf's head. He did not like the look of them at all. She paused, studying Grace's face more carefully now, some understanding beginning to dawn in her young eyes. Are you the one they are looking for? There was no use in lying, not with the girl's sharp eyes already piecing together the truth. Grace nodded slowly. I do not know why, she admitted. I have done nothing wrong that I know of, but yes, I believe I am. The girl considered this with a seriousness beyond her years, then glanced once more toward the farmhouse before speaking again, her voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. There is a path through the orchard that skirts around the main road entirely. It comes out near the old mill on the far side of Redmore, away from the market square where the riders were asking questions. If you follow the wall until it ends, then cut through the trees toward the sound of the mill wheel, you should reach it without passing through the square at all. Grace stared at her, startled by the kindness of a stranger who owed her nothing. Why would you help me? The girl shrugged, as though the answer were obvious. Because you look frightened, and because those riders frightened me too, though I would never admit that to my father. Whatever trouble you are in, I do not think it is trouble you asked for. She glanced back toward the farmhouse one final time. I should return before I am missed. Good fortune to you, whoever you are. Before Grace could offer any proper thanks, the girl had already turned and hurried back toward the orchard, her basket of apples swinging against her hip. Grace watched her go for a moment, feeling an unexpected warmth amid the fear that had gripped her since midnight, then turned and followed the stone wall as the girl had instructed, eating one of the apples as she walked, the sweetness a small comfort against the uncertainty ahead. The path through the orchard was quiet, shaded by rows of fruit trees heavy with the last of the season's harvest, and Grace made good time, her bare feet grateful for the softer ground beneath the trees, compared to the harsh stubble of the fields. As she walked, her mind returned again and again to the girl's description of the riders. Black cloaks, no proper crest, an iron badge shaped like a wolf's head. Whoever had sent men to her door in the night, it was not, it seemed, the open and lawful authority of the crown itself, but something operating in shadow, deliberately hiding its true allegiance behind unmarked cloaks and unfamiliar symbols. That thought offered Grace no comfort at all. Lawful men, however frightening, could at least be reasoned with, appealed to, questioned before magistrates. Men who hid their true masters answered to no one but the person who had sent them, and that person, whoever they were, clearly wanted her found and silenced, with no witnesses and no questions asked. By the time the sound of a distant mill wheel reached her ears, turning steadily somewhere ahead through the trees, the sun had climbed well past its peak, and Grace's legs ached with a tiredness that went beyond mere walking. She pressed on regardless, driven by the knowledge that stopping now, so close to Redmore, would only give the riders more time to close the distance behind her. She did not know, as she walked, that Agnes was at that very moment 3 miles to the north, hidden in the loft of a friendly miller's barn, watching through a gap in the boards as riders in black cloaks searched the yard below. She did not know that the old woman had drawn 2 of the search parties away from the river path entirely, leading them on a false trail toward the eastern hills, buying Grace precious hours of unwatched road. She knew only that she was alone, hunted, and carrying a secret stitched into a piece of damp cloth that she did not yet understand. The mill came into view at last, through a gap in the trees, its great wooden wheel turning slowly in the current, water cascading in bright arcs that caught the afternoon light. Beyond it, the rooftops of Redmore spread out along the riverbank, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the distant hum of market voices carrying faintly on the breeze. Somewhere in that town, Grace hoped, she might find safety, however temporary. Somewhere in that town, she might begin to understand who Eowyn truly was, and why a dead king's blood in her veins had made her the most hunted woman in the kingdom. She took a steadying breath, tucked the damp cloth more securely inside her shawl, and stepped out from the shelter of the orchard trees, toward whatever waited for her next. Redmore smelled of wood smoke, fish, and wet stone, and the noise of it struck Grace like a wave after the silence of the riverside path. Carts rattled over cobbles, merchants called out prices for cloth and grain. Somewhere near the square, a group of children chased a dog between the stalls, their laughter cutting through the general clamor of the town. For a moment, standing at the edge of it all, Grace felt almost invisible, one more traveler among many, and she allowed herself a small measure of hope that she might slip through unnoticed. That hope lasted only until she saw the notice nailed to a post outside the baker's shop. A crude drawing had been pinned beneath a short block of text, and though the likeness was rough, exaggerated in the way such hurried sketches always were, Grace recognized enough of her own face in it to feel her stomach drop. The words beneath offered a reward for information leading to the woman's capture, describing her as a fugitive wanted for crimes against the crown's peace, though no specific crime was named. At the bottom, stamped in ink rather than the royal seal she might have expected, was a symbol she now recognized instantly. A wolf's head, jaws slightly parted, staring out from the page. She turned away quickly, pulling her shawl further over her hair, and forced herself to walk at an ordinary pace, though every instinct screamed at her to run. Around her, townspeople went about their business, most paying her no mind at all, but she could not shake the feeling that any one of them might glance at the notice, then at her face, and see the resemblance others had missed. She needed somewhere to disappear, at least for a little while, somewhere she could think without the constant fear of discovery pressing against her thoughts. The mill she had passed on her way into town offered one possibility. Millers were often busy people, too occupied with grain and machinery to pay close attention to a quiet stranger asking for shelter in exchange for work. She turned back the way she had come, moving with purpose now, and made her way toward the sound of the turning wheel. The miller, a broad man with flour dusted permanently into the creases of his hands, eyed her with suspicion when she first approached, but softened somewhat when she offered to work through the afternoon in exchange for a meal and a corner of the barn to rest in. He asked few questions, which suited Grace perfectly, and set her to sweeping spilled grain and stacking sacks, while his wife prepared a simple stew in the small kitchen attached to the mill house. It was hard, honest work, and for a few hours, Grace allowed herself to lose her fear in the rhythm of the labor, sweeping and lifting and carrying, until her arms ached in a way that felt almost ordinary again, almost like the life she had lost only a day before. But even as she worked, her mind kept circling back to the questions that had followed her out of Ashbourne. Who was Elowen? Why had her mother stitched a crown into a piece of cloth and hidden it away for 19 years? And where, in all this chaos, had Agnes disappeared to? As evening settled over Redmore, painting the sky in deep orange and violet, Grace finally allowed herself to rest in the small loft above the mill's storage room, tucked between sacks of grain that still smelled faintly of the harvest. The miller's wife had brought her a bowl of stew and a blanket without being asked, and Grace ate gratefully, feeling warmth spread through her tired limbs for the first time since the previous night. She had nearly drifted into an exhausted sleep when she heard voices below, muffled through the floorboards, and her eyes snapped open, every nerve suddenly alert. Asking in every house along the river road, one voice was saying, low and urgent, "They say she was seen near the orchard this morning. If she has any sense, she will not linger in Redmore," a second voice replied. This one Grace recognized instantly as the miller's own. The whole town has seen that notice by now. She would be a fool to stay past nightfall. "Let us hope she is exactly that foolish then," the first voice said, and there was something in its tone, cold and clipped, that made the hair on Grace's arms stand on end. This was not the miller's usual manner of speech. This was someone else entirely. Grace held perfectly still, straining to hear more, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give her away through the floor itself. "We will search the mill regardless," the stranger continued. "Lord Blackwood does not tolerate half measures, and neither, I assure you, do I." Lord Blackwood. The name meant nothing to Grace, and yet the way it was spoken, with a mixture of fear and deference, told her everything she needed to know about the man's importance. Whoever Lord Blackwood was, he commanded enough authority to send searchers with unmarked cloaks and wolf badges across the countryside, and he commanded enough fear that even a stranger's mere mention of his name carried weight. Grace rose slowly from her makeshift bed, careful to make no sound, and moved to the small gap in the loft's wooden wall that offered a narrow view of the yard below. 3 men stood near the mill's entrance, torches already lit against the gathering dusk, their black cloaks unmistakable, even in the fading light. The miller stood before them, his broad shoulders tense, his hands twisting nervously at the hem of his apron. "I have told you already," the miller said, his voice strained but steady. "No young woman has come through here today. Only farmhands and merchants, same as any other day." The lead searcher studied him for a long moment, then glanced toward the mill building itself, his gaze traveling slowly upward toward the loft where Grace stood frozen behind the thin wooden wall. She stepped back instinctively, though she knew the gap was far too small for him to have seen her through it. "We will search regardless," the searcher repeated. "Step aside." Grace's mind raced. There was no way out of the loft except the ladder leading down into the storage room, and the storage room's only exit led directly into the yard where the searchers now stood. She was trapped, unless she could find another way, and she had only moments before the men began climbing the ladder themselves. Her eyes fell on the small window at the loft's far end, little more than a gap left for ventilation, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Beyond it, she could see the mill's water wheel turning steadily in the current, and beside it, a narrow wooden platform used for maintenance work on the machinery. It was not much of a plan, but it was the only one she had. She heard footsteps on the ladder below, heavy and deliberate, and did not wait to see who emerged into the loft. She crossed to the window in 3 quick strides, pulled herself up onto the sill, and squeezed through the narrow gap, feeling splinters catch at her sleeve as she forced her shoulders through the opening. For one terrifying moment, she hung suspended above the turning wheel, the rush of water loud beneath her, before her feet found purchase on the narrow maintenance platform. Behind her, she heard a shout of discovery, the searcher having reached the loft only to find it empty, and she knew she had only seconds before they realized where she had gone. She edged along the platform, the spray from the wheel soaking her clothes, until she reached the far end where a narrow ladder led down to the riverbank below. She descended as quickly as she dared, her hands slipping on the wet rungs, and had just reached the bottom when she heard the searchers emerge from the mill's main door, torches held high, scanning the darkening yard for any sign of movement. "There," one of them called, spotting her at the base of the ladder. "By the water." Grace did not wait to hear more. She ran, following the riverbank downstream, away from the mill and away from Redmore entirely, her bare feet pounding against wet stone and mud as the shouts of the searchers rose behind her. She heard the splash of someone entering the shallows in pursuit, heard the creak of a bow being drawn, and threw herself sideways behind a large boulder just as something whistled past her ear and struck the rock with a sharp crack. Her heart hammering, she scrambled along the bank, using the boulders and reeds for cover, putting as much distance as she could between herself and the mill. The shouts behind her grew fainter as the darkness deepened, the searchers apparently unwilling to venture too far from their torchlight into the unknown terrain of the riverbank at night. She did not stop running until her legs simply refused to carry her any further, and she collapsed against the trunk of a fallen tree, gasping for breath, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Above her, the first stars had begun to appear in the darkening sky, cold and distant, and utterly indifferent to the desperate chase unfolding beneath them. It was then, in the relative safety of the darkness, that Grace allowed herself to truly consider what she had learned. Lord Blackwood, a name spoken with fear by men who wore no crest of their own, who hunted her not with the open authority of the crown, but with the secrecy of men accustomed to operating beyond the reach of ordinary law. Whoever this Lord Blackwood was, his reach extended far beyond a single search party at her cottage door. It extended across the countryside, into towns like Redmore, into the fears of ordinary millers who dared not refuse his men entry. She thought of the notice nailed to the post outside the baker's shop, the crude sketch of her own face, the promise of reward for her capture. Whoever Lord Blackwood was, he wanted her found badly enough to spend considerable resources on the effort, and he wanted her found quietly enough that his men wore no official colors, answered to no name but his own. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind her, and Grace's whole body tensed, ready to run again if necessary. But no torchlight followed, no shout of discovery, only the ordinary sounds of the night settling around her, an owl calling somewhere in the distance, the river continuing its steady flow toward the sea. She allowed herself a moment longer to rest, pressing her back against the rough bark of the fallen tree, and closed her eyes, forcing herself to think clearly, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. She could not return to Redmore, not with the notice already spread through the town, and searchers actively hunting the riverbank. She could not return to Ashbourne, not with her cottage almost certainly still watched by Blackwood's men. She had no coin, no food beyond what remained of the second apple in her pocket, and no clear idea of where safety might be found. But she had a name now, Lord Blackwood, and a symbol, a wolf's head stamped in ink, that marked every notice and every searcher hunting her through the countryside. Somewhere, someone would know more about this man, about why he wanted a poor seamstress's daughter found and silenced badly enough to spend such effort on the search. She thought suddenly of an old woman who sometimes visited Ashbourne's market, a traveling healer named Nora who was rumored to have once served in the capital itself, before retiring to wander the countryside, treating the sick in exchange for whatever coin or goods they could spare. Agnes had always spoken of her with a strange mixture of familiarity and caution, as though the two women shared a history neither fully explained. If anyone might know something of Lord Blackwood, or of the truth behind the name Elowin, it might be her. The healer's usual route, as Grace recalled from overheard market gossip, took her through the string of small villages along the eastern hills, the very direction Agnes had apparently led the searchers earlier that day. It was a slim hope, built on fragments of memory and half-remembered rumor, but it was the only direction Grace could think to move in. She rose slowly from her resting place, her body protesting every movement, and began walking east, away from the river, away from Redmore, toward the distant hills, silhouetted black against the star-filled sky. Behind her, faint and growing fainter with every step, the sounds of the search continued along the riverbank, torches bobbing like distant fireflies in the darkness. Grace did not know, as she walked, that Lord Blackwood himself sat at that very moment in a chamber far to the north, reading a report of the night's failed search, with an expression of cold, controlled fury. She did not know that his patience, already thin after nearly 2 years of searching for exactly this bloodline, was beginning to fray in ways that would soon transform a quiet hunt into something far larger and far more dangerous. She knew only that she was still alive, still free, and still moving forward into a truth she was only beginning to understand. The eastern road climbed steadily as the night deepened, winding between low stone walls that marked the boundaries of sleeping farms. Grace kept to the edges of the path, ready to duck into the shadow of a hedge or wall at the first sign of hoofbeats, but the road remained empty for hours, save for the occasional call of a night bird or the distant bark of a farm dog catching some unfamiliar scent on the wind. She thought, as she walked, of the healer Nora, trying to piece together every fragment of memory she could recall. She remembered Nora as a small, weathered woman, with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority despite her humble traveling cart. Remembered the way Agnes always seemed to stand a little straighter whenever the healer passed through Ashbourne. Remembered snatches of conversation overheard through the cottage walls late at night, conversations that had made little sense to a young girl, but now, in hindsight, seemed to carry a weight she had never understood. Once, when Grace was perhaps 12 years old, she had woken in the night to the sound of Nora's voice in the kitchen below, low and urgent, speaking words that had lodged themselves in her memory without her ever knowing why. She keeps growing more like her mother every year. Someone will notice eventually. We cannot hide her forever behind Ashbourne's walls. At the time, Grace had assumed the words referred to some ordinary resemblance, the kind any daughter might share with a departed mother. Now, walking alone through the darkness, with a stitched cloth hidden against her chest, and searchers combing the countryside behind her, those words took on an entirely different meaning. Nora had known. Nora had always known exactly who Grace truly was, and had spent years helping Agnes keep that truth buried. The thought brought both comfort and fresh anxiety in equal measure. Comfort, because it meant Nora might indeed hold answers Grace desperately needed. Anxiety, because it meant the circle of people who had known her secret was larger than she had ever imagined, and larger circles meant greater risk of the truth eventually reaching ears it was never meant to reach. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, streaked with the first pale hints of dawn, Grace had reached the edge of the hill country, where the flat farmland gave way to rolling slopes, dotted with sheep and gorse. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond simple tiredness, a bone-deep weariness that made every step feel like wading through deep water, but she forced herself onward, knowing that daylight would bring renewed danger of discovery on the open road. She found shelter at last in a small copse of trees just off the main path, tucked behind a fallen log where the morning mist still clung thick to the ground, and allowed herself, finally, to sleep. She woke sometime past midday to the sound of bells, distant and rhythmic, the kind used by shepherds to keep track of their flocks across the open hillside. For a moment, disoriented by sleep and hunger, Grace simply lay still, listening, before the memory of the previous 2 days came flooding back with sudden, sickening clarity. She sat up slowly, every muscle protesting the movement, and peered out from her hiding place toward the hillside beyond. A flock of sheep grazed peacefully in the morning light, tended by a young shepherd who sat on a nearby rock, apparently lost in his own thoughts, whistling some idle tune to himself. There was no sign of searchers, no black cloaks, no torches, only the ordinary peace of a countryside going about its business, entirely unaware of the desperate flight unfolding at its edges. Grace allowed herself a small measure of relief, though she knew better than to trust it fully. Blackwood's men had shown themselves capable and determined, and she doubted they had abandoned the search after a single failed night. She needed to keep moving, to find Nora before her pursuers found her first, and she needed, more than anything, to find food and water before her strength failed entirely. She approached the shepherd cautiously, keeping her hands visible and her manner as unthreatening as she could manage, and he looked up at her approach with more curiosity than alarm. "You look like you have had a rough few days," he said, echoing almost exactly the words the orchard girl had spoken the day before, and Grace found herself managing a tired, humorless smile at the coincidence. "I have," she admitted. "I do not suppose you know a healer named Nora, who travels these hills treating the sick." The shepherd's expression shifted, something like recognition crossing his weathered young face. "Old Nora, aye. Everyone in these hills knows her. She passed through just yesterday morning, headed toward Thornfield Village to tend a fever that has been spreading through the eastern farms." He studied Grace more closely now, taking in her exhausted state, her travel-worn clothes, the desperate hope in her eyes. "You are not sick yourself, are you? You look more like you are running from something than toward it." Grace hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal to a stranger, however kind his manner seemed. "I need to find her," she said simply. "It is a matter of some urgency." The shepherd nodded slowly, apparently deciding not to press further. "Thornfield is perhaps 3 hours' walk from here, following the ridge path north. You will know you are close when you smell the smoke from the village kilns." He paused, then reached into a small satchel at his side and withdrew a wrapped bundle, offering it to her without further comment. "You look like you could use this more than I could." Grace accepted the bread and cheese gratefully, murmuring her thanks, and the shepherd simply nodded again, returning his attention to his flock, as though the exchange had been the most ordinary thing in the world. She ate as she walked, following the ridge path north as he had instructed, the food restoring some measure of strength to her exhausted limbs. The hills rolled gently around her, patched with morning shadow and golden light, and for a brief while, walking alone beneath the wide sky, Grace allowed herself to think not of Blackwood or his searchers, but of the mother she had never known, the woman who had given her the name Elowen, and a piece of cloth stitched with a secret worth chasing across an entire kingdom. She wondered what her mother had looked like, whether she shared Grace's own dark hair and gray eyes, whether she had walked these same hills once, perhaps fleeing some danger of her own. She wondered how a poor seamstress had ever come close enough to a king to bear his child, and what had happened to her afterward, whether she had died as Agnes always claimed, or whether some darker fate had befallen her at the hands of men like Blackwood. The questions multiplied faster than Grace could hope to answer them alone, and she found herself walking faster, driven now by more than simple fear of pursuit. She needed the truth, needed it the way she needed food and water and shelter. And Nora, if the healer truly knew as much as Grace suspected, represented her best hope of finally understanding the danger that had upended her entire life in the span of a single night. By the time the smell of kiln smoke reached her on the afternoon breeze, exactly as the shepherd had promised, Grace's exhaustion had given way to something closer to determination. Whatever waited for her in Thornfield, whatever truths Nora might reveal, she intended to face them with whatever strength remained to her, and to finally understand why a dead king's blood in her veins had made her the most hunted woman in the kingdom. Thornfield turned out to be smaller than Grace had expected, a scattering of stone cottages clustered around a central well, with smoke rising steadily from the kilns at its edge where potters worked the local clay into jars and bowls for trade. She approached carefully, keeping to the outer paths rather than walking directly through the village center, her earlier encounter with the notice in Redmore still fresh enough in her memory to make her cautious of any place with more than a handful of eyes to notice a stranger. She found Nora at the far edge of the village, kneeling beside a straw pallet inside a small cottage, tending to a child whose fever had left her cheeks flushed and her breathing shallow. Grace hesitated at the doorway, reluctant to interrupt, but the healer looked up almost immediately, her sharp eyes finding Grace's face across the dim room with an intensity that suggested she had been expecting exactly this visit for quite some time. "Wait outside," Nora said quietly, not to Grace, but to the child's anxious mother hovering nearby. "Let me finish here, and then we will speak." The mother nodded, casting a curious glance toward Grace as she stepped past her into the afternoon light, and Grace retreated to wait beneath the shade of a nearby tree, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Nora had recognized her instantly, without a word of introduction, and that recognition alone confirmed everything Grace had suspected during her long walk through the hills. It was nearly an hour before Nora finally emerged from the cottage, wiping her hands on a cloth tucked into her belt, her expression unreadable as she approached Grace beneath the tree. "The fever will break by morning," Nora said, more to herself than to Grace, before finally meeting her eyes directly. "You have your mother's face, you know. I would have known you anywhere, even after all these years." Grace's throat tightened, unexpected emotion rising at the mention of the mother she had never known. "Then you knew her," she managed. "You knew Isolde." Nora's eyebrows rose slightly at the name, and for a moment, something like sorrow passed across her weathered features. "So Agnes told you that much at least. I had wondered how much she would reveal, if this day ever came." She glanced around the quiet edge of the village, then gestured toward a narrow path leading away from the cottages, toward a small grove of trees, where they might speak without curious ears. "Come, this is not a conversation for open ground." They walked together in silence until the village had faded from view behind them, and Nora finally settled onto a fallen log within the shelter of the grove, gesturing for Grace to sit beside her. For a long moment, the healer simply studied Grace's face, as though searching for traces of a woman long gone, before she finally began to speak. "Your mother came to the palace as a seamstress when she was barely older than you are now," Nora said. "She had a gift for her craft that caught the attention of the royal household almost immediately, and within a year, she was mending garments for the king himself. Was not, by that point in his reign, a happy man. His queen had given him no living children after 3 difficult births, and the court had grown thick with whispers about succession, about rivals circling like vultures waiting for an old man to finally die without an heir." Grace listened, hardly daring to breathe, as Nora continued. "Isolde was kind, and clever, and utterly without ambition for herself, which is perhaps exactly why the king trusted her in ways he trusted almost no one else at court. Their friendship became something more, over the course of several years, quietly, carefully, hidden from the queen, and from the ambitious lords, who would have used such knowledge as a weapon. When your mother discovered she carried Edmund's child, she came to me first, terrified of what discovery might mean, not for herself, but for the babe she carried." "What did the king do?" Grace asked quietly, "when he learned of me?" Nora's expression softened slightly. "He loved you before you were even born, Elowen. That much I can tell you with certainty. He could not acknowledge you openly, not without destroying his marriage, and likely starting a war among the lords who supported the queen's family. But he made certain provisions, quietly, through channels only a handful of trusted people knew about. What sort of provisions? Nora hesitated, glancing once more toward the path behind them, as though checking for followers, before lowering her voice further. A private decree, signed and sealed by his own hand, recognizing you as his true-born child, and naming you among those with a legitimate claim to succession, should his queen never produce a living heir of her own. The document was never made public. It was hidden, entrusted to only a few people the king trusted absolutely, meant to be revealed only if the succession itself ever came into serious doubt. Grace felt the weight of this settle over her like a physical thing, the pieces of her life rearranging themselves into a shape she could barely comprehend. And did it, she asked, come into doubt? The queen never bore another child, Nora said simply, and when Edmund died 2 years ago, the throne passed, by the ordinary rules of succession, to his nephew, a man named Aldrich Blackwood, son of the king's younger sister. Blackwood had spent years positioning himself for exactly this outcome, building alliances among the lords, ensuring his claim would face no serious challenge. But she paused, her expression grim. But a decree exists, somewhere, naming you as a legitimate claimant with a right to challenge his rule, and Blackwood has known of its existence for nearly as long as he has held the throne. Then he has been searching for me, Grace said slowly, not simply because of who my mother was, but because I represent a genuine threat to his crown. More than a threat, Nora said. A legitimate claim, properly proven, would not merely challenge his rule. It would end it entirely, and likely end his life along with it, given how thoroughly he has entrenched himself through fear rather than genuine loyalty. Men who seize power through fear rarely survive its loss gracefully, and Blackwood knows this better than anyone. He cannot simply imprison you and be done with it. Your existence itself, once proven, unravels everything he has built. Grace sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of what Nora had revealed. She had come to Thornfield hoping for answers about her mother, about the strange name stitched into a piece of cloth, and had instead learned that she stood, unknowingly, at the center of a struggle for the entire kingdom's throne. Where is the decree now? She finally asked. The document itself, do you know where it is hidden? Nora's expression grew troubled. I know only fragments. Your mother entrusted different pieces of knowledge to different people, precisely so that no single person captured or questioned could reveal the whole truth. I know the decree exists, and I know it bears the king's personal seal, which cannot be easily forged or disputed once presented before the full Council of Lords. But where it is hidden, exactly, I cannot say with certainty. That knowledge, if anyone still holds it, likely rests with someone closer to the king's own household than I ever was. Then who? Grace pressed. Who would know? Before Nora could answer, a sound from the direction of the village reached them, faint but unmistakable. A horse, approaching at speed along the main path. Nora rose immediately, her earlier calm replaced by sharp alertness, and gestured for Grace to stay low, hidden among the trees. Someone rides in haste, Nora murmured, moving toward the edge of the grove to gain a clearer view of the path below. That is rarely good news in these hills. Grace crouched among the undergrowth, her heart pounding once more with renewed fear, watching as Nora crept closer to the village edge. After several long moments, the healer returned, her expression grave. A rider has come to Thornfield, asking after a stranger seen on the ridge path this morning, Nora said quietly. The shepherd who gave you bread, it seems, mentioned your passing to a neighbor, not out of malice, I am certain, but simple village gossip travels faster than either of us can outrun it. Blackwood's men are not far behind. Grace's breath caught. Then I must leave. Now, before they search the grove itself. You must, Nora agreed, but not without this. She reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew a small, folded piece of parchment, pressing it into Grace's hands with an urgency that left no room for argument. This bears the name of a man who once served as the king's personal scribe, a man named Cuthbert who retired to a monastery in the northern hills some years before Edmund's death. If anyone beyond myself knows the decree's hiding place, it is him. Find the Abbey of St. Serwyn, ask for Brother Cuthbert, and tell him Isolde's daughter has finally come seeking the truth her mother died protecting. The word died struck Grace like a physical blow. Died, she repeated. Then she truly is gone. I had hoped, perhaps, that Agnes simply told me that story to protect me, that somewhere she might still be alive. Nora's expression softened with genuine sorrow. I am sorry, Elowen. Your mother gave her life protecting the secret of your birth, and the decree that proves it, not long after you were placed in Agnes's care as an infant. She was discovered attempting to retrieve the document from its hiding place, cornered by men loyal to the Queen's family, who feared exactly the kind of challenge to succession you now represent. She never revealed its true location, not even at the end. Whatever price was demanded of her, she paid it in silence, to keep you safe. Grace felt tears gathering, hot and sudden, but forced them back, aware of the danger still closing in around them. There would be time to grieve properly later, if she survived long enough to find it. For now, she needed to move, and she needed to carry her mother's sacrifice forward, into whatever truth still waited to be uncovered. The Abbey of St. Serwyn, she repeated, committing the name to memory. How far? 3 days' walk, perhaps less if you can find safe passage on the northern road, Nora said. But you cannot go alone, not with Blackwood's men already this close behind you. Wait here. She turned and hurried back toward the village edge before Grace could protest, disappearing among the cottages for what felt like an agonizing eternity before finally returning, accompanied by a young man Grace did not recognize, tall and lean, with the bearing of someone who had once carried a soldier's discipline, even if he no longer wore a soldier's uniform. This is Edward, Nora said quickly. He served among the palace guard before Blackwood's rise, and left rather than swear loyalty to a man he considered no rightful king. He knows the northern roads better than anyone I could find on such short notice, and he owes your mother's memory a debt he has long wished to repay. Edward inclined his head toward Grace, his expression serious, but not unkind. Whatever help I can offer, it is yours, he said simply. We should move quickly. The riders will reach Thornfield within the hour. Grace looked between Nora and Edward, feeling the weight of her mother's sacrifice and her own uncertain future pressing down upon her in equal measure, and nodded, rising from her hiding place among the trees. Then let us move, she said, before they find us standing still. They left the grove at a swift pace, Edward leading them along a route that avoided the main path entirely, cutting instead through a series of narrow sheep tracks that wound between the hills, invisible, unless one already knew precisely where to look. Nora remained behind in Thornfield, insisting that her presence would draw less suspicion than her sudden absence, and promising to send word ahead to contacts along the northern road if she learned anything further of use. She has done this before, Edward said quietly, as they climbed a steep rise overlooking the village below, where Grace could just make out the distant shapes of riders entering Thornfield's central square. Helped people disappear, I mean. During the chaos after Edmund's death, when Blackwood moved against anyone who might have opposed his claim, Nora hid no small number of frightened people in these hills. She has a gift for it. Grace watched the riders dismount below, their movements even at this distance carrying an unmistakable air of practiced efficiency, and felt a fresh wave of gratitude toward the healer who had risked so much on behalf of a stranger she had not seen in 19 years. Will she be safe, now that they know she spoke with someone matching my description? Edward's expression grew thoughtful. Nora is careful, and well-liked in these hills. The villagers will not easily confirm her involvement, even under questioning. But we should not linger to test that theory. Come, there is a shepherd's shelter perhaps 2 hours further along this ridge, where we can rest until dark, then continue toward the northern road under cover of night. They walked in relative silence for much of the afternoon, the terrain growing rougher as they moved further from the cultivated farmland surrounding Thornfield, into wilder country, where gorse and heather dominated the landscape, and the wind carried a sharper chill down from higher elevations. Grace found herself studying her companion as they walked, curious despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. You said you left the palace guard rather than serve Blackwood, she said eventually. What was he like, before he became king? Did you know him personally? Edward's jaw tightened slightly at the question. I served under his command for nearly 3 years, back when he was simply a nobleman with ambitions he kept carefully hidden behind a mask of loyalty to his uncle. He was clever, patient, and utterly without mercy toward anyone who stood between himself and what he wanted. When Edmund fell ill in his final months, Blackwood positioned his own men throughout the palace guard, replacing anyone whose loyalty he doubted, myself included, though I left before he could formally dismiss me and mark me as a potential enemy. "Do you believe he had a hand in the king's death?" Grace asked, the question emerging before she had fully considered whether she wanted to know the answer. Edward was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I cannot prove it, and I would not speak such an accusation carelessly, but Edmund's illness came suddenly and worsened with a speed that surprised even the royal physicians. Blackwood wept convincingly enough at the funeral, I will grant him that much. Whether those tears were genuine, only he knows for certain." They reached the shepherd's shelter as the afternoon light began to fade, a simple stone structure built into the hillside, weathered but sturdy, clearly maintained by local herders for exactly this kind of temporary refuge. Edward built a small, carefully shielded fire once darkness had fully settled, just enough to ward off the evening chill without risking visibility from any distance. "Tell me about my mother," Grace said quietly, as they sat together near the small flame. Not the danger surrounding her, not the decree or the secrets, simply who she was, if you know anything at all. Edward considered the question carefully. "I never knew her personally, I am sorry to say. I was young when she served at the palace, barely more than a stable boy at the time. But I remember hearing the kitchen staff speak of her fondly, long after she had gone. They said she had a gentle way about her, that she never treated servants as beneath her notice, the way so many at court did, that she sang softly to herself while she worked, old songs from the villages, rather than the formal court music everyone else favored." Grace found herself smiling despite everything, a small, fragile warmth spreading through her chest at this simple human detail, so different from the grand tragedy and political danger that had otherwise defined every mention of her mother's memory. "She sang," she repeated softly. "I would like to have heard that." "Perhaps you carry the gift yourself," Edward offered, even without knowing it. They fell into comfortable silence after that, watching the small fire burn low, and Grace found her thoughts drifting, despite her exhaustion, to all that remained ahead of her. 3 days to the Abbey of St. Serwyn, if the roads remained clear. A monk named Cuthbert, who might hold the final piece of knowledge needed to prove her claim. And behind her, always behind her, the growing shadow of a king who would stop at nothing to ensure that truth never saw the light of day. She did not yet know how right Nora's warning about escalation would prove to be, did not know that even now, in his chambers far to the north, Blackwood had received word of a stranger matching her description, questioning villagers near Thornfield, and had responded not with the handful of searchers who had chased her from Ashbourne, but with an order that would soon set an entire kingdom in motion. For now, beneath the shelter of the hillside stones, with Edward's steady presence beside her and the small fire casting warm light against the gathering darkness, Grace allowed herself a rare moment of quiet hope. She had survived 2 days of pursuit. She had learned her mother's name, her mother's sacrifice, and the true shape of the danger that hunted her. And somewhere ahead, at an abbey in the northern hills, waited the final proof that might yet turn the tables on the man who had sent so many to silence her. She closed her eyes, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the distant call of a night bird somewhere across the darkened hills, and allowed herself, finally, to rest. Far to the north, in a chamber lit by a dozen tall candles, despite the early hour, Lord Aldrich Blackwood read the report handed to him by a kneeling messenger, and felt something cold settle deep in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced with such intensity since the final weeks of his uncle's illness. "A woman matching the description," he read aloud, his voice flat and controlled despite the fury building beneath it, seen near Redmore, then again near Thornfield, questioning villagers and accompanied, according to one witness, by a woman believed to be a traveling healer known to... He set the parchment down carefully on the polished surface of his desk and looked up at the messenger still kneeling before him. "And she was not captured." "No, my lord. She escaped the mill at Redmore through means still unclear, and by the time our men reached Thornfield, she had already fled the village entirely." Blackwood said nothing for a long moment, his fingers drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm against the desk's edge. He was a tall man, still relatively young for the weight of authority he carried, with sharp features that had once been called handsome by court flatterers, before his rise to power had hardened something in his expression that made even seasoned lords hesitate to meet his gaze directly. 2 years. 2 years he had ruled since his uncle's death. 2 years spent carefully cementing alliances, silencing whispers, ensuring that his claim to the throne faced no serious challenge from any quarter. He had believed, until quite recently, that the greatest danger to his rule had already passed, that Edmund's secret decree, if it truly existed at all, had been lost or destroyed, along with the seamstress who once carried his uncle's illegitimate child. He had been wrong, and the realization sat bitter and heavy in his chest. "Send for General Thorne," Blackwood said finally, his voice carrying the particular quiet that those who knew him best had learned to fear far more than any shout. "And summon the full council for this evening. I want every available search party doubled by morning, and I want the northern roads watched with particular attention. If this woman intends to reach the hill country beyond Thornfield, I want her found before she gets there." The messenger bowed and hurried from the chamber, leaving Blackwood alone with his thoughts and the flickering candlelight. He rose from his desk and moved to the tall window overlooking the capital's sprawling rooftops, his expression unreadable as he considered the full weight of what this new information meant. For 2 years, he had told himself a comfortable story, that as old as death had ended any real threat to his succession, that whatever child she might have borne had likely died in infancy, or lived in such obscurity that no one would ever connect her to the throne. He had allowed himself to believe this story because believing anything else meant confronting a truth he found genuinely unbearable, that his entire reign rested on foundations far less secure than he had convinced himself and his council to accept. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and his personal advisor, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Osric, who had served him faithfully since before his rise to power, entered without waiting for formal permission, a privilege earned through years of careful, discreet service. "You have heard then," Osric said, closing the door quietly behind him. "I have heard," Blackwood confirmed, not turning from the window. 19 years, Osric. 19 years. I have waited for this particular ghost to finally lie still, and now she rises to walk the countryside, asking questions about her mother's death. "The girl herself likely knows very little," Osric offered carefully. "If she has only just begun asking questions, it suggests she has only just learned the truth of her own parentage. She may not even know the decree exists. She knows enough to survive 2 encounters with our search parties and vanish into the countryside both times," Blackwood said, his voice sharpening. "Whether she fully understands the danger she represents or not, others clearly do. That healer, and whoever else assists her, they understand precisely what is at stake, and if they reach anyone who knows the decree's location before we find them, this ceases to be a quiet matter, handled by a handful of discreet men in black cloaks." He finally turned from the window, his expression settling into the cold, calculating mask that Osric had learned to recognize as the true face of the man beneath the king's crown. "I want this handled decisively, Osric. Not with a handful of searchers stumbling through the countryside like fools, but with overwhelming force that leaves no possibility of failure. If she reaches the northern hills, if she finds anyone who can point her toward that decree, everything I have built comes apart. I will not allow that." "What do you propose?" Osric asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer and found it troubling. "There have long been whispers of unrest in the hill country," Blackwood said slowly, the plan clearly forming even as he spoke it aloud. "Bandits along the trade roads, villages slow to pay their taxes, the usual grumbling of a countryside that has never fully accepted authority from the capital. I have been patient with these grumblings, perhaps too patient. It is time, I think, for a proper campaign to restore order to the region, a campaign that happens, quite naturally, to require thorough searches of every village, every abbey, every farmstead between here and the northern border." Osric's expression grew grave as understanding dawned. "You mean to deploy the army itself, not simply search parties, but a full military campaign, framed as suppressing rebellion." "I mean to find her, Osric, by whatever means necessary. And I mean to do it in a manner that raises no uncomfortable questions from the council about why their king suddenly takes such personal interest in a single missing woman from a village most of them have never heard of. A campaign against banditry raises no such questions." A campaign against banditry, conveniently, also allows me to search every corner of the hill country without anyone outside this room understanding the true purpose behind it. The cost of such a campaign will be considerable, Osric said carefully. 10,000 men, perhaps more, mobilized across the northern provinces. The council will ask questions about expense, if nothing else. Then we will answer their questions about expense, Blackwood said, his tone final. I would rather spend every coin in the treasury than allow a woman with a 19-year-old grudge and a dead seamstress's dying wish to unravel everything I have built. Summon the council. I will present this as a matter of restoring proper order to a troubled region, nothing more. By week's end, I want the campaign underway. Osric bowed, though something in his expression suggested continued reservation about the scale of the response Blackwood proposed. As you command, my lord, though I might suggest, if I may, that such a visible campaign carries risks of its own. 10,000 men marching through the hill country will not go unnoticed, and unnoticed is precisely what this matter has required until now. Unnoticed is no longer an option, Blackwood said flatly. She has already survived quiet measures twice over. I will not risk a third failure simply to preserve the appearance of subtlety. Let the campaign proceed openly. Let the council believe whatever comfortable story I offer them about bandits and unpaid taxes. What matters is that she is found and silenced before she reaches anyone who can turn her 19-year-old bloodline into a genuine crisis for this crown. Osric bowed once more and withdrew from the chamber, leaving Blackwood alone again, with his thoughts and the steadily burning candles. He returned to his desk, drawing a fresh sheet of parchment toward himself, and began composing the formal orders that would, within days, set an entire kingdom's military apparatus in motion, all in pursuit of a single young woman who, at that very moment, slept peacefully beneath a hillside shelter many miles to the south, entirely unaware of the storm now gathering against her. Meanwhile, as dawn broke over the hill country, Grace woke to find Edward already awake, carefully extinguishing the last embers of their small fire and scanning the horizon with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to watching for danger. We should move quickly today, he said, as she rose and gathered her few belongings. Something feels different this morning, though I could not say exactly what. Call it a soldier's instinct, but I would rather we cover as much ground as possible before midday. Grace did not question his instinct. She had learned, over the past 2 days, to trust the quiet certainty in Edward's voice when he spoke of danger, and she gathered her shawl around her shoulders, tucking the precious cloth and the parchment bearing Brother Cuthbert's name securely against her chest, before following him out into the pale morning light. Neither of them could have known, as they set off toward the northern road, that Blackwood's council had already convened, that the formal orders for a massive campaign across the hill country were already being drafted, or that within a matter of days, the quiet countryside they walked through would be transformed entirely, flooded with soldiers marching under the banner of restoring order, all in pursuit of the truth Grace carried, unknowing, in her own blood. The northern road proved rougher than the paths they had followed thus far, cutting through dense forest that Edward explained had once served as a boundary between rival territories, long before the kingdom had unified under a single crown. Ancient stones, worn smooth by centuries of weather, still marked the old borders here and there among the trees, silent witnesses to conflicts long forgotten by most who now walked this path. My grandfather used to tell stories about this forest, Grace said, recognizing the landscape from tales Agnes had shared during long winter evenings. He claimed it was haunted by the spirits of soldiers who died defending the old borders. Edward glanced at her with mild surprise. You had a grandfather? I confess I had assumed, given everything Nora explained, that you knew almost nothing of your family before yesterday. Grace managed a small, sad smile. Agnes's grandfather, I should say. Though she raised me to call her family my own, she never let me forget that I had people who loved me, even if she could never fully explain who my true parents were. I suppose now I understand why she was always so careful with her words. They walked in companionable silence for a while after that, the forest canopy filtering the morning light into shifting patterns across the path ahead. Grace found herself grateful for Edward's steady presence, for his willingness to share stories and knowledge without pressing her for more than she was ready to share in return. After the terror of the past 2 days, his calm competence felt like solid ground beneath feet that had grown accustomed to running. It was nearing midday when Edward suddenly held up a hand, signaling silence, and drew them both off the main path into the cover of a dense thicket. Grace crouched beside him, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention, and after a moment, she heard it too, the distant but unmistakable sound of many horses moving along the road ahead, accompanied by the rhythmic tramp of marching feet. "That is far more than a simple search party," Edward murmured, his expression tense as he peered through the thicket toward the road. "That sounds like a proper military column." They waited, hardly daring to breathe, as the sound grew steadily closer, until finally, through gaps in the foliage, Grace caught her first glimpse of the approaching force. Dozens of mounted soldiers led a much larger column of infantry, their armor catching glints of sunlight through the canopy, banners bearing Blackwood's personal crest snapping in the light breeze. The column seemed to stretch back along the road further than Grace could see, an endless procession of men and horses moving with grim, purposeful efficiency. "How many?" Grace whispered, though some part of her already dreaded the answer. Edward's jaw tightened as he continued watching the column pass. "More than I have seen assembled in one place since before Edmund's death. This is no ordinary patrol, Grace. This is the beginning of something far larger." They remained hidden for what felt like an eternity as the column continued past their position. Soldiers, supply wagons, more mounted officers, the sheer scale of the force growing more alarming with every passing minute. Finally, as the last stragglers of the column disappeared around a bend further up the road, Edward allowed himself to exhale slowly, his expression grave. "Blackwood has decided the quiet approach has failed," he said, once he judged it safe enough to speak at normal volume. "Whatever we witnessed just now, I would wager considerable coin that it represents only the beginning of a much larger deployment. He means to flood the entire hill country with soldiers, search every village, every farmstead, every abbey between here and the northern border, and he means to do it under some cover story that will satisfy the council without revealing his true purpose." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the forest shade. "Because of me. Because I survived 2 searches, and he fears what might happen if I reach someone who knows where the decree is hidden." "Because of you," Edward confirmed quietly. "And because a man who rules through fear rather than genuine loyalty cannot afford even the smallest crack in the foundation of his authority. If word spreads that a legitimate claimant to the throne walks free in the countryside, asking questions about her mother's death, it will not matter whether you ever find the decree itself. The mere rumor of your existence, properly nurtured by the right lords with grievances against Blackwood's rule, could be enough to spark genuine rebellion." The weight of this settled over Grace with fresh gravity. She had understood, in the abstract, that she represented a danger to Blackwood's throne. But watching that endless column of soldiers pass along the road, banners snapping in the breeze, the true scale of that danger, and the resources Blackwood was willing to commit to eliminating it, struck her with sudden, visceral force. "We cannot continue on the main road," Edward said, already calculating their options aloud. "Not with a force that size moving in this direction. We will need to find another route to the Abbey, one that avoids the main thoroughfares entirely." "Do you know such a route?" Grace asked, though she already suspected the answer given Edward's evident familiarity with these hills. "I know of one," he said carefully. "An older path, used mostly by shepherds and the occasional smuggler moving goods to avoid the crown's tax collectors. It will add perhaps a full day to our journey, and the terrain will be considerably harder going, but it should keep us well clear of any organized search." Grace nodded, understanding without needing further explanation that the choice, difficult as it might be, offered their only reasonable hope of reaching the Abbey of St. Serwyn before Blackwood's soldiers flooded every accessible path between here and the northern border. "Then let us find it," she said, "before that column decides to double back and search this very thicket." Edward managed a small, grim smile at that, rising from their hiding place and gesturing for her to follow. "A fair point. Come, we have considerable ground to cover, and considerably less time than I would prefer to cover it in." They set off together, leaving the main road behind, striking out instead into the deeper forest where older, Half-forgotten paths wound between ancient trees, carrying them steadily northward, away from the column of soldiers now marching purposefully through the hill country, and toward whatever truth still waited to be found at the Abbey of St. Serwyn. Neither of them could have known, as they pushed deeper into the forest shadow, that the column they had witnessed represented merely the first wave of a mobilization that would, within the week, see nearly 10,000 men spread across the entire northern region, transforming the quiet countryside Grace had once called home into the staging ground for the largest manhunt the kingdom had witnessed in a generation, all in pursuit of a single young woman whose only crime was the blood that ran, unbidden and unasked for, through her veins. The old smuggler's path proved every bit as difficult as Edward had warned, winding steeply up through rocky terrain where loose stones shifted treacherously underfoot, and low branches forced them to duck and weave through passages barely wide enough for a single person. By late afternoon, Grace's legs burned with an exhaustion that made every step feel like a small battle, but she pressed on regardless, driven by the memory of that endless column of soldiers, marching steadily toward the very hills they now climbed. "How much further to the Abbey?" she asked, during a brief pause to catch their breath at a rocky outcropping that offered a clear view of the valley below. Edward studied the landscape for a moment before answering, his eyes tracing the distant line of hills where, presumably, their destination waited. 2 days, perhaps, if this path holds as I remember it. Longer if we encounter any obstacles that force us to backtrack. Grace nodded, accepting this without complaint, though her body protested at the thought of 2 more days pushing through terrain this demanding. She glanced down toward the valley floor, where the main road they had abandoned earlier wound its way northward, and felt a fresh chill at what she saw there. Even from this distance, she could make out the unmistakable shapes of additional columns moving along the road, smaller than the first they had witnessed but numerous enough to suggest that Edward's prediction of a much larger deployment was already proving accurate. "They are spreading out," she observed quietly, "not simply marching north in one great column, but dividing into smaller groups to cover more ground." Edward followed her gaze, and his expression grew grimmer still. "A methodical search, then, rather than a single sweep. That will make evasion considerably harder in the coming days. We should assume every village, every crossroads, every place where a traveler might reasonably stop for food or shelter will eventually fall under scrutiny." They continued climbing as the afternoon wore on, and Grace found herself, despite her exhaustion, turning Edward's earlier words over in her mind, particularly his careful, measured suggestion that Blackwood might have played some hand in his uncle's death. If true, it painted a portrait of a man capable of almost anything to secure and maintain his power. A man for whom the deployment of 10,000 soldiers against a single young woman represented not excess, but simple, ruthless practicality. "Tell me more about how he came to power," she said, as they paused again near a small spring bubbling up between the rocks, allowing themselves a brief rest to refill their water. Not simply the illness that took Edmund, but what happened afterward. How did a nephew's claim override any other possible heir, if the succession was truly so uncertain? Edward considered the question carefully before responding. The succession had always been a delicate matter, even before Edmund's final illness. He had no living children by his queen, as I mentioned, and the nearest legitimate bloodline ran through his younger sister, who had married into a minor noble house, and produced 2 sons before her own early death some years past. Blackwood, as the elder of those 2 sons, held the strongest conventional claim, and he spent years cultivating support among the council specifically to ensure that claim would face no serious challenge. And the younger son? Blackwood's own brother? What became of him? Edward's expression darkened further. Cedric, his name was. A gentler soul by most accounts, less ambitious than his elder brother, content to serve in a minor administrative role rather than pursue the throne directly. He died barely 3 months before Edmund himself, in what was officially recorded as a hunting accident. Grace felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "You believe Blackwood had a hand in that death as well?" "I believe," Edward said carefully, "that a great many convenient deaths surrounded Blackwood's rise to power, and that a man wise enough to survive in that court learns not to ask too many questions about convenient timing." Cedric's death removed the last plausible rival within the immediate family line. Edmund's death, 3 months later, opened the throne itself. Whether Blackwood's hand guided both events directly, or whether he simply proved remarkably fortunate in the timing of his enemy's misfortunes, the result was the same. He inherited a throne, with remarkably little genuine opposition remaining to challenge him. They resumed their climb as the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, and Grace found herself thinking of her own mother, of the sacrifice Nora had described, dying to protect a secret that might have changed everything had it come to light before Blackwood fully consolidated his power. She wondered how different the kingdom might look now, had Isolde survived long enough to see the decree properly presented before the full council. Had Edmund lived long enough to formally acknowledge his daughter before his own convenient illness claimed him. Such thoughts served little practical purpose, she knew, beyond deepening her own grief and anger, but she found she could not fully set them aside as they pressed onward through the darkening forest, the sound of distant search parties, still occasionally drifting up from the valley below, a constant reminder of the danger that continued closing in around them with every passing hour. They made camp that night in a small cave Edward remembered from some earlier journey through these hills, tucked well back from the path itself, and largely invisible, unless one already knew precisely where to look. They dared not risk a fire this time, given how close the search parties had drawn during the day's climb, and settled instead into the cave's shadowed interior, sharing the last of the bread and cheese the shepherd had provided nearly 2 days earlier. "You have grown quiet," Edward observed, as they settled in for what promised to be a cold, uncomfortable night. "Understandable, given everything you have learned these past 2 days, but I would rather you speak your thoughts than carry them silently. We have a difficult road still ahead of us, and I would rather know what weighs on you than have it surface at some more dangerous moment." Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering how to properly articulate the tangle of emotions that had built steadily within her since Nora's revelations in Thornfield. "I keep thinking," she finally said, "about how different everything might have been, had my mother lived, had the decree been presented before Blackwood secured his throne so thoroughly. I keep wondering whether all of this, the soldiers, the search parties, the danger to everyone who helps me, whether it might have been avoided entirely, if only things had happened differently." "Such thoughts serve little purpose," Edward said gently, "though I understand the impulse to think them. We cannot change what has already happened, Grace. We can only decide what we do now, with the truth as it stands before us." "And what do you believe I should do?" she asked. "Once we reach the Abbey, once we find Brother Cuthbert and whatever knowledge he holds, even if we find the decree itself, even if we prove my claim beyond any doubt, what then?" "Blackwood commands 10,000 soldiers, apparently without hesitation. I have you, and Nora, and whatever aid we might find along the way. That hardly seems a fair contest." Edward considered the question seriously before responding. "A legitimate claim, properly proven before the full Council of Lords, carries weight beyond simple military force, Grace. Blackwood rules through fear and careful political maneuvering, not through the genuine loyalty of those beneath him. Many among the Council, and many among the common people themselves, harbor doubts about the legitimacy of his rule. Doubts they have kept carefully hidden, simply because no viable alternative has ever presented itself. Proof of your claim, presented at the right moment, before the right audience, could shift the entire balance of power in this kingdom far more effectively than any army we might hope to raise on our own." Grace turned this thought over carefully in her mind, finding in it a small measure of hope amid the exhaustion and fear that had otherwise defined her past 3 days. "Then that is what we must do," she said finally. "Find the decree, and find a way to present it, before those who might actually act on the truth it contains." "That is my hope as well," Edward agreed quietly. "Though I confess, I do not yet know precisely how we accomplish such a thing, given the scale of the search now arrayed against us. One step at a time, perhaps. First, the Abbey. First, Brother Cuthbert. The rest we will determine as the path reveals itself." They settled into an uneasy rest after that, taking turns keeping watch through the cold night hours, and Grace found her mind returning again and again to the image of that endless column of soldiers marching through the valley below, banners snapping in the wind, a vast and terrible machine set into motion entirely on her account. She did not yet fully understand the scale of what Blackwood had ordered, did not yet know that similar columns were, at that very moment, spreading across every corner of the northern provinces, transforming quiet villages and peaceful farmsteads into a landscape of checkpoints and searches, the likes of which the kingdom had not witnessed in living memory. She knew only that the danger continued growing with every passing day, and that whatever waited for her at the Abbey of St. Serwyn represented perhaps her only real hope of turning the full weight of that danger back against the man who had unleashed it. They woke before dawn to the sound of distant voices carrying up from the valley, and Edward moved immediately to the cave's entrance, peering carefully around the rock formation that shielded their hiding place from view. Grace joined him after a moment, and together they watched as a search party moved slowly along the base of the hill they had climbed the previous day, torches still lit against the pre-dawn darkness, their voices carrying clearly enough on the still morning air that Grace could make out fragments of their conversation. Ordered to check every cave and hollow along this ridge before midday. Lord Blackwood himself has taken personal interest in this search, or so the captain says. Grace's blood ran cold at the mention of Blackwood's personal involvement, and she exchanged a worried glance with Edward, whose expression had grown equally grave. "We cannot stay here," he murmured, already gathering their few belongings. "If they intend to search every cave along this ridge, we need to be well clear before they reach this position." They slipped out of the cave as quietly as possible, moving in the opposite direction from the search party's voices, climbing higher into the hills where the terrain grew increasingly rugged and difficult. The morning light, when it finally broke fully over the eastern horizon, revealed a landscape of jagged rock formations and sparse, wind-bent trees, a wilderness far removed from the gentle farmland Grace had called home for her entire life. By mid-morning, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the search party, but Grace's relief proved short-lived when Edward suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for silence, his expression tense as he studied the path ahead. "Someone approaches," he murmured. Alone, from the sound of it, and moving with purpose, rather than the cautious pace of a searcher, they took cover behind a large boulder, watching as a lone figure emerged from around a bend in the path ahead, a weathered man in traveling clothes, leading a heavily laden mule. He moved with the confident stride of someone who knew these hills intimately, and Edward's tense posture relaxed slightly as the man drew closer, apparently recognizing something familiar in his appearance. "Marcus," Edward called out, stepping from their hiding place with evident relief. "I had not expected to encounter you on this path." The man startled, his hand moving instinctively toward a knife at his belt, before recognition dawned in his own weathered features. "Edward, by all the old gods, I thought you had left these hills for good when you abandoned the palace guard." He glanced curiously toward Grace, his expression turning more cautious. "And who is your companion?" "A friend in need of safe passage," Edward said carefully. "Marcus here has spent 20 years moving goods through these hills without troubling himself over the crown's tax collectors. If anyone knows a route through this search that we have not already considered, it is him." Marcus studied them both for a long moment, clearly weighing some internal calculation before finally speaking again.
"You could not have chosen a worse week for such passage."
"I have never seen so many soldiers flooding these hills, not in all my years working this route. Something has stirred Blackwood's court into a proper frenzy, though I confess I have heard nothing but vague rumors about bandits and unpaid taxes, which strikes me as remarkably thin justification for the scale of force I have witnessed these past 2 days." "We are trying to reach the Abbey of St. Serwyn," Edward said, choosing his words carefully. "Is there a route you know that might avoid the worst of the search?" Marcus considered this, scratching thoughtfully at his weathered chin. "There is an old drover's path, rarely used these days, that skirts well east of the main search area, before turning north toward the Abbey. It adds considerable distance, and the terrain grows quite treacherous in places, but it should keep you clear of the soldiers currently flooding the more obvious routes." He paused, studying Grace with fresh curiosity. "This friend of yours must be quite important, to warrant such elaborate precautions." "More important than either of us can properly explain at present," Edward said simply. "But I would consider it a great personal favor if you could guide us toward that path, or at least, point us toward its beginning." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the risk of involvement against whatever loyalty or debt he felt toward Edward from their apparent shared history. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I owe you more than one favor from years past, Edward, and I have never much cared for Blackwood's manner of rule in any case, whatever excuse he offers for flooding these hills with soldiers. Follow me. I can guide you as far as the path's beginning, though I dare not accompany you further than that. My own business requires I keep to routes that raise no undue suspicion." They followed Marcus for the better part of 2 hours, the trader sharing what news he had gathered from other travelers along his usual routes, painting an increasingly alarming picture of the scale of Blackwood's deployment across the entire northern region. Checkpoints had been established on every major road. Villages were being searched systematically, house by house, with particular attention paid to any household sheltering strangers or recent travelers. Even the abbeys, traditionally left undisturbed by secular authority out of respect for religious tradition, had apparently not been spared entirely from the general climate of suspicion and search. This last detail struck Grace with particular unease. "Do you think Brother Cuthbert might already be under watch?" she asked Edward quietly, as Marcus led them along an increasingly narrow and overgrown path. "If the abbeys themselves are being searched." "It is possible," Edward admitted grimly, "though I would hope a former royal scribe living quietly among religious brothers has attracted little specific attention, compared to more obvious targets. We will simply need to approach with appropriate caution when we arrive." They reached the beginning of the drover's path as the afternoon light began to lengthen into evening shadows, and Marcus paused there, offering a final assessment of the route ahead. "Follow this path north for perhaps a day and a half, keeping always to the eastern side of the ridgeline where the trees grow thickest. It will bring you out near a small stream that eventually joins the river close to the abbey's outer walls. From there, the final approach should be relatively straightforward, assuming the search has not extended quite that far east by the time you arrive." Edward thanked him warmly, and Marcus, after a final curious glance toward Grace, turned back the way they had come, leading his mule back toward whatever business awaited him, along his usual trading routes, leaving Grace and Edward alone once more, at the beginning of the narrow path that would, they hoped, finally carry them safely to the Abbey of St. Serwyn and the answers that waited there. "We should press on while daylight remains," Edward said, studying the path ahead with evident determination. "Every hour we delay gives Blackwood's search more time to extend its reach further east." Grace nodded, gathering her remaining strength for the journey ahead, and together they set off along the narrow, overgrown path, leaving behind the more heavily searched territory to the west, and moving steadily onward toward whatever truth still waited, hidden and dangerous, at their journey's end. The drover's path proved even more demanding than Marcus had suggested, winding through dense thickets and across steep, rocky slopes where a single misstep might mean a serious fall. Grace found her earlier exhaustion deepening into something closer to genuine physical strain, her legs trembling with fatigue by the time Edward finally called a halt as evening settled over the hills. "We have made good progress," he offered, noting her evident weariness with a sympathetic expression. "By tomorrow evening, if this pace holds, we should reach the stream Marcus described, and from there, the abbey itself lies within easy reach." Grace nodded, too tired for extended conversation, and they settled into another cold, fireless camp among a cluster of wind-sculpted rocks that offered at least partial shelter from the evening chill. Sleep came quickly despite her discomfort, exhaustion finally overwhelming the anxious thoughts that had otherwise kept her mind churning through each previous night. She woke the following morning to gray, overcast skies and a light drizzle that had begun sometime before dawn, soaking through her shawl and leaving her thoroughly chilled before they had covered even a mile of the day's journey. Edward pressed forward regardless, his expression grimly determined, and Grace forced herself to match his pace despite the discomfort, understanding, without needing to be told, that delay now, so close to their destination, risked everything they had already sacrificed to reach this point. The rain continued through much of the day, turning the narrow path treacherous with mud and slick exposed roots, but by late afternoon, exactly as Edward had predicted, they finally reached the stream Marcus had described, its swollen waters running fast and brown with the day's rainfall. They followed its course northward, the terrain gradually leveling as they descended from the higher hills toward the river valley, where, according to Edward's estimation, the Abbey of St. Serwyn waited perhaps another few hours' journey ahead. It was nearing dusk when they first glimpsed the Abbey's outline against the darkening sky, a cluster of stone buildings surrounded by a low wall, with a single tall bell tower rising above the rest, silhouetted dramatically against the last traces of daylight fading in the west. Grace felt a surge of relief at the sight, quickly tempered by Edward's sudden, cautious pause. "Something is wrong," he murmured, studying the scene ahead with narrowed eyes. "Look there, near the main gate." Grace followed his gaze, and felt her relief curdle into fresh alarm. Even at this distance, she could make out the unmistakable shapes of soldiers stationed at the Abbey's entrance, their dark cloaks, and the faint glint of weapons visible despite the fading light. "They have already reached it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Blackwood's men are already here." Edward's jaw tightened as he studied the scene more carefully. "Not a full search, from what I can see. Perhaps a dozen men stationed at the main entrance, likely watching for anyone attempting to enter or leave, rather than actively searching the grounds themselves. It suggests they suspect the Abbey may hold relevance to their search, but have not yet confirmed exactly what they are looking for." "Then how do we reach Brother Cuthbert?" Grace asked, "without alerting them to our presence?" Edward considered the question carefully, his eyes tracing the Abbey's outer wall for any alternative approach. Abbeys of this size typically maintain more than one entrance, particularly for deliveries of goods and supplies that need not pass through the formal main gate. If we can locate such an entrance, we might avoid the soldiers stationed at the front entirely. They circled carefully around the Abbey's perimeter, under cover of the gathering darkness, moving slowly and cautiously to avoid drawing the attention of the soldiers still visible near the main gate. After nearly an hour of careful searching, Edward finally located what he sought, a smaller gate set into the rear wall, apparently used for deliveries from the Abbey's own gardens and workshops, currently unwatched by any visible guard. "This should serve," he murmured, testing the gate carefully and finding it fortunately unlocked. "Though we should move quickly and quietly. If soldiers are watching the main entrance, it stands to reason they may patrol the grounds themselves at intervals, even if this particular gate currently stands unguarded." They slipped through into a small garden, rows of vegetables and herbs barely visible in the deepening darkness, and made their way carefully toward the main cluster of buildings, staying close to the shadows cast by the outer walls. Grace's heart pounded with every step, acutely aware of how easily a single misstep, a single careless sound, might bring the soldiers stationed nearby down upon them both. They found a young monk tending to evening chores near the kitchen buildings, and Edward approached him carefully, keeping his voice low. "We seek Brother Cuthbert, on a matter of some urgency. Can you help us find him, without drawing unwanted attention?" The young monk startled at their sudden appearance, then studied them both with evident suspicion, glancing nervously toward the direction of the main gate. "You should not be here. The soldiers stationed outside have already questioned the abbot twice about strangers seeking entrance. If they learn you have slipped past their watch, it will go poorly for all of us." "We understand the risk," Grace said, stepping forward despite Edward's cautionary glance. "But the matter we bring to Brother Cuthbert concerns a truth he has protected for many years, a truth that grows more urgent with every day it remains hidden. Please, if you can help us reach him quietly, I promise we will bring no more danger to this abbey than already threatens it." The young monk studied her for a long moment, something in her evident sincerity apparently swaying his hesitation. "Wait here, in the shadow of the kitchen wall. I will see if Brother Cuthbert can be found without drawing attention." He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Grace and Edward waiting anxiously in the shelter of the wall, every sound from the surrounding grounds setting their nerves further on edge. Long minutes passed before the young monk finally returned, accompanied by an elderly man whose weathered face and stooped posture spoke of many years, but whose eyes, when they finally settled on Grace, carried a sharpness that belied his apparent frailty. "Elowyn," the old man said quietly, before Grace had spoken a single word of introduction, and she felt a fresh shock at hearing her true name spoken with such immediate, certain recognition. "I had wondered, these past 2 years, whether I would ever see this day. You have your father's eyes, though you carry your mother's face." "You knew them both," Grace said, hardly daring to breathe. "You are Brother Cuthbert." "I am," the old man confirmed, glancing nervously toward the direction of the main gate, before gesturing for them to follow him deeper into the shadows, away from open ground. "Though we cannot speak safely here. Come, quickly, before any patrol passes near enough to notice." He led them through a narrow passage between two buildings, finally reaching a small, isolated chamber that appeared to serve as his personal quarters, sparse and simple in the manner of religious devotion, but offering at least the privacy their conversation urgently required. Once the door had closed securely behind them, Cuthbert turned to face Grace directly, his expression grave. "I served as King Edmund's personal scribe for nearly 15 years, he began, his voice steady, despite his evident age. "I drafted the decree myself, at his direct instruction, in the final months before your birth. I know its contents better than any person now living, save perhaps yourself, once you finally read it." "Then you know where it is hidden," Grace said, hope and urgency warring in her voice. Cuthbert's expression grew troubled. "I know where it was hidden, 19 years ago, when your mother and I together concealed it, beyond the reach of anyone who might use it against you before you were old enough to understand its weight. Whether it remains in that same location after all these years, I confess I cannot say with certainty. I retired from court service shortly after your mother's death, and have had no cause nor safe opportunity to verify the decree's continued safety since that time." Grace's heart sank slightly at this uncertainty, though she pressed forward regardless. "Where was it hidden then? Whatever uncertainty remains, it is more than I knew even an hour ago." Before Cuthbert could answer, a sharp knock sounded at his door, and all three of them froze, exchanging alarmed glances in the flickering candlelight. "Brother Cuthbert," a voice called from outside, formal and clipped in a manner that immediately marked its owner as no ordinary monk. "We have reason to believe strangers have entered these grounds without proper authorization. I must ask you to open your door for inspection." Cuthbert's eyes widened slightly, but his voice, when he responded, carried a calm steadiness that Grace could only admire given the circumstances. "One moment, please. I was at prayer, and must compose myself properly before receiving visitors." He turned immediately to Grace and Edward, gesturing urgently toward a narrow door set into the far wall of his small chamber, nearly invisible in the dim candlelight. "That leads to the scriptorium, where the brothers copy sacred texts. From there, a passage connects to the old chapel, no longer in regular use, which has an exit leading directly to the orchard beyond the outer wall. Go now, quickly, and I will delay them as long as I am able." "Come with us," Grace urged, though she already understood, from the resigned determination in his expression, that he had no intention of fleeing. "I am an old man who has served this abbey faithfully for many years," Cuthbert said gently. "My sudden disappearance would raise far more suspicion than my continued presence answering their questions honestly, so far as I am able without revealing what truly matters. Go, both of you, find shelter in the orchard, and I will send the young monk who guided you here to find you, once the soldiers have completed their search and departed." The knock sounded again, more insistent this time, and Cuthbert gestured urgently toward the narrow door. Grace hesitated only a moment longer, before following Edward through the passage, casting one final glance back at the old monk, as he moved to answer his chamber door, his expression settling into practiced serenity, despite whatever fear he must have carried beneath it. The scriptorium beyond proved dark and silent, rows of writing desks visible in the faint moonlight filtering through high windows, the air thick with the scent of parchment and ink. They moved quickly and carefully across the room, following Cuthbert's directions toward a second passage that Edward located after a brief, anxious search along the far wall. Behind them, faintly audible even through the stone walls, they heard the sound of voices, Cuthbert's steady tone mixing with the sharper, more demanding voice of whoever had come seeking entrance to his chamber. Grace strained to hear more, but Edward tugged gently at her sleeve, urging her onward through the passage before their continued delay risked discovery. The old chapel, when they finally reached it, proved smaller than Grace had expected, its altar covered in a thin layer of dust that suggested infrequent use, faint moonlight streaming through a single stained glass window set high in the far wall. Edward moved immediately toward a low door near the altar, testing it carefully before finding it, thankfully, unlocked. "The orchard should lie just beyond," he murmured, easing the door open just enough to peer through into the darkness beyond. "Come, quickly, before anyone thinks to check this passage." They slipped through into the cool night air, finding themselves exactly as Cuthbert had promised, amid neat rows of fruit trees stretching toward a low stone wall, marking the abbey's outer boundary. Edward led them carefully through the orchard, keeping to the deeper shadows beneath the trees, until they reached a section of wall low enough to climb without excessive difficulty. They had just cleared the wall, dropping down into the darkness of the open field beyond, when a sharp cry rose from somewhere back within the abbey grounds, followed quickly by the sound of running feet and raised voices calling out in evident alarm. "They have discovered something," Edward said grimly, grabbing Grace's arm and pulling her into a swift run across the open field, away from the abbey's walls and toward the cover of a distant tree line barely visible in the darkness. "We cannot know whether it concerns us directly or some other matter entirely, but we dare not risk finding out. Run, Grace, now." They ran together through the darkened field, the sounds of alarm behind them growing louder, mixing now with what sounded unmistakably like the barking of hunting dogs, and Grace felt fresh terror rising in her chest at the prospect of pursuit by scent as well as sight. Her legs, already exhausted from days of hard travel, protested every stride, but she forced herself onward, matching Edward's pace as best she could manage. They reached the tree line, just as the first shouts of pursuit rose clearly audible behind them, torches now visible bobbing along the abbey's outer wall as soldiers spilled out into the field in search of whatever had triggered the alarm. Edward pulled Grace deeper into the trees, weaving between trunks and low branches with practiced efficiency, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the pursuing lights. They did not stop running until the sounds of pursuit had faded into the general darkness of the night, replaced by nothing but the sound of their own labored breathing and the distant call of night creatures, disturbed by their passage. Edward finally called a halt beside a small stream, gesturing for Grace to catch her breath, while he listened carefully for any continued sign of pursuit. "I believe we have outrun them, for now," he said finally, though his tone carried little genuine relief. "But we have lost the answer we came seeking. Cuthbert never told us where the decree is hidden." Grace's chest tightened at this realization, the desperate flight having driven all thought of Cuthbert's unfinished revelation from her mind until this very moment. "We cannot return," she said, understanding the truth even as she spoke it aloud. "Not with the abbey now fully alerted and soldiers searching the grounds." "No," Edward agreed grimly, "we cannot, though perhaps, if Cuthbert survives their questioning without revealing anything of true value, he may yet find some way to send word to us, as he promised. The young monk who guided us to him may know how to find us again, if we can determine a safe location to wait for such contact." Grace sank down against the base of a nearby tree, exhaustion and disappointment washing over her in equal measure. They had come so close, closer than at any point since Nora's revelations in Thornfield, only to have the crucial final answer snatched away at the last possible moment by the sudden arrival of Blackwood's soldiers. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly, staring up at Edward with an expression that carried more vulnerability than she had allowed herself to show since the very first night of her flight from Ashbourne. "If we cannot return to the Abbey, and Cuthbert's knowledge remains locked away with him, how do we ever find this decree?" Edward settled down beside her, his own exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders, though his voice remained steady and reassuring despite the setback. "We do not give up, Grace. Whatever has happened at the Abbey tonight, Cuthbert struck me as a man of considerable resolve, well practiced in protecting secrets far more dangerous than his own safety. I do not believe he will reveal anything of true value, whatever questions Blackwood's soldiers press upon him. We will find a way to reach him again, or find some other path toward the truth we seek. This setback is not the end of our search. It is merely an obstacle we must find a way around." Grace nodded slowly, drawing what comfort she could from his steady confidence, though the exhaustion and fear of the past days weighed heavily upon her as she finally allowed herself to rest against the rough bark of the tree, listening to the distant, fading sounds of a search that showed no sign of ending any time soon. Neither of them yet knew that within Cuthbert's small chamber, the old monk had indeed revealed nothing of value to his questioners, maintaining his composure through even the most pointed interrogation, protecting with quiet, unwavering determination the secret he had guarded faithfully for 19 long years. Nor did they know that word of the incident at the Abbey of St. Serwyn would soon reach Blackwood himself, confirming his growing suspicion that Elowen's search had led her precisely toward the answers he most desperately needed to prevent her from finding, and prompting a response that would soon transform the already massive search into something far more overwhelming still. They spent an uneasy night hidden among the trees, taking turns keeping watch while the other attempted what rest exhaustion would allow, and dawn found them both stiff and weary, but alive and still undiscovered. Edward suggested moving further from the abbey, before attempting any contact with Cuthbert's young monk messenger, reasoning that the immediate area would remain heavily watched for at least another full day following the previous night's alarm. They found a small hollow beside a stream perhaps 2 miles further into the forest, sheltered enough to offer reasonable safety while remaining close enough that a messenger, if one came, might still locate them without excessive difficulty. Grace spent much of that day in restless waiting, her thoughts circling endlessly between hope that Cuthbert had survived his questioning without revealing anything of value, and fear that his continued silence might mean something far worse had befallen him. It was nearing evening on the second day of their wait, when Edward, keeping watch near the hollow's edge, suddenly signaled for quiet, his posture tensing as he peered through the undergrowth toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Grace held her breath, one hand instinctively moving toward the small knife Edward had given her for protection, until the figure finally emerged into view, and she recognized with a rush of relief the young monk who had first guided them to Cuthbert's chamber. "You found us," Grace said, rising quickly to greet him. "Is Brother Cuthbert safe?" The young monk nodded, though his expression remained troubled. He endured their questioning without revealing anything of true value, though it cost him greatly. The soldiers searched the entire abbey grounds for 2 full days before finally withdrawing, apparently satisfied that whatever alarm had been raised held no further substance worth pursuing. "Brother Cuthbert asked me to find you, once it seemed safe to do so, and to deliver this." He withdrew a small, tightly folded piece of parchment from within his robes, pressing it carefully into Grace's hands. She unfolded it with trembling fingers, finding within a short passage of careful, precise handwriting that could only belong to a man well practiced in the art of formal scribing. "The decree rests where your mother's own hands last placed it, sealed within the old family chapel at Ashbourne, beneath the stone marking the resting place of those who served that parish faithfully before her. The brass key your guardian left you on the night your flight began was crafted for exactly this purpose, though she herself may not have fully understood its significance when she pressed it into your keeping. Return to Ashbourne, if you can find safe passage, and trust that your mother's final act of protection still waits precisely where she left it, 19 years past." Grace read the message twice, her heart pounding with a mixture of astonishment and renewed hope. "It was in Ashbourne all along," she said, hardly daring to believe it. "Hidden in the very village I fled from that first terrible night." Edward read the message over her shoulder, his own expression reflecting similar surprise. "A clever hiding place in truth. Blackwood's men searched your cottage thoroughly, I would wager, but a decree hidden within the parish chapel, beneath a grave marker no less, would escape even the most thorough search, unless someone knew precisely what they sought and where to look for it." "The brass key," Grace said, reaching into the small bundle she had carried since that first desperate night, withdrawing the key Agnes had left on the kitchen table alongside the folded cloth bearing her true name. She had carried it faithfully through every mile of her flight, never fully understanding its purpose beyond some vague assumption that it might unlock a door or chest of personal significance. Now, finally, its true importance settled upon her with fresh weight. Agnes must have known, she continued slowly, turning the key over in her fingers. Perhaps not the full truth of where the decree was hidden, but enough to understand this key's importance, enough to ensure I carried it with me when I fled. The young monk shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the darkening sky. "I should return to the abbey before my absence draws unwanted notice. Brother Cuthbert asked me to convey one further message, if I may. He said to tell you that your mother loved you fiercely, and that everything she sacrificed gladly, believing that you would one day find your way to exactly this truth. He asked that you carry that knowledge forward, whatever path you choose from here." Grace felt tears gathering once more at these words, and she thanked the young monk warmly before he departed back into the darkness, leaving her alone with Edward and the weight of everything they had finally learned. "Ashbourne," Edward said thoughtfully, once the monk had disappeared from view. "A journey of perhaps 4 days from here, assuming we can find reasonably safe passage. Though I confess, given how thoroughly your own village was searched during those first terrible hours of your flight, I would expect it remains under close watch even now." "Then we will need to be careful," Grace said, determination replacing some measure of her earlier exhaustion. "But we cannot delay, Edward. Every day we wait is another day. Blackwood's soldiers spread further across the countryside. Another day the decree remains vulnerable to discovery by someone other than myself." They set off the following morning, retracing much of their earlier path but now angling steadily southward, back toward the village Grace had fled nearly a week earlier. The journey proved slower than either of them would have preferred, forcing them to avoid the main roads entirely, given the continued presence of search parties spread throughout the region, but they made steady progress nonetheless, driven by the renewed hope that Cuthbert's message had provided. It was on the 3rd day of their journey south, as they moved carefully through a stretch of farmland not far from the outskirts of Ashbourne itself, that Grace first spotted a familiar figure moving along a distant hedgerow and felt her heart leap with sudden, overwhelming recognition. "Agnes," she breathed, hardly daring to believe her own eyes. "Edward, that is Agnes." They approached carefully, mindful of the open ground and the risk of drawing unwanted attention, but as they drew closer, the old woman turned and spotted them in return, her weathered face breaking into an expression of such profound relief that Grace found herself running the final distance between them, without any further thought for caution. "You are alive," Agnes said, pulling Grace into an embrace that carried 19 years of careful, guarded love, finally allowed to express itself openly. "I feared the worst, child, when I could not find any trace of you after that first terrible night. I led those searchers on a chase through the eastern hills for 2 full days, hoping to buy you time, and when I finally circled back toward Ashbourne, I found no sign of you anywhere, only rumors spreading through the countryside of a young woman evading capture across half the northern provinces. I found Nora," Grace explained quickly, "and then Brother Cuthbert, at the Abbey of St. Serwyn. I know the truth now, Agnes. I know about my mother, about the decree, about everything you protected me from for all these years." Agnes's expression grew solemn at this, though relief still shone clearly in her eyes. "I always knew this day might come, though I confess I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that it might never arrive at all, that you might live your whole life in peaceful ignorance of the danger your blood carried." She glanced toward Edward, taking in his presence with evident curiosity. "And who is this, who has apparently helped keep you safe through such a perilous journey?" "Edward," Grace introduced quickly. "He served in the palace guard before Blackwood's rise, and has guided and protected me since Nora sent us both from Thornfield toward the Abbey." Agnes studied Edward carefully for a long moment, before nodding slowly, apparently satisfied by whatever assessment she had made. "Then I owe you my gratitude, whatever your reasons for offering such assistance. Come, both of you. We cannot linger in open ground, not with soldiers still watching the roads so closely. I know a place we can shelter safely, while you tell me everything that has happened since that terrible night." She led them to a small, hidden shepherd's hut, tucked into a fold of the hills overlooking Ashbourne itself, a place apparently known only to a handful of locals who used it during lambing season, currently empty, and offering welcome shelter from the open danger of the surrounding countryside. Once inside, with the door secured and a small, carefully shielded fire finally providing warmth against the evening chill, Grace explained everything that had happened, from her desperate flight through the hollow wood, to Nora's revelations in Thornfield, to Cuthbert's message revealing the decree's true hiding place within Ashbourne's own parish chapel. Agnes listened with grave attention, occasionally nodding as though confirming details she had long suspected but never fully known, and when Grace finally finished, the old woman sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "I always wondered about that key," she admitted finally. "Your mother pressed it into my hands the very night she brought you to me as an infant, along with strict instructions that I should keep it safe and give it to you only if the day ever came when you needed to learn the full truth of your birth." She never explained its purpose beyond that, and I confess I had long assumed it might simply hold some sentimental value, a memento of her own life before circumstances forced her into hiding. Then it seems her caution served its purpose even beyond her own lifetime, Edward observed quietly. A secret so carefully guarded that even those who carried its pieces never fully understood their significance, until the moment truth finally demanded it. The chapel remains standing, I assume, Grace said, turning her attention toward the practical challenge that now faced them. But surely it lies within Ashbourne itself, which must remain closely watched, given everything that happened there that first night. Agnes's expression grew thoughtful. The village has indeed remained under watch, though the intensity has lessened somewhat these past days, as Blackwood's search has spread across the wider region. The chapel itself sits at the village's edge, somewhat removed from the main cluster of homes and the market square where most of the watching soldiers tend to station themselves. With sufficient care, and perhaps under cover of darkness, I believe it may be possible to reach it without drawing undue attention. Then that is what we must do, Grace said, feeling the weight of 19 years of careful sacrifice, her mother's death, Agnes's guardianship, Nora's guidance, and Cuthbert's steadfast silence under questioning, all converging toward this final, crucial step. Tonight, if possible, before Blackwood's search can somehow discover what we now know. Agnes nodded slowly, though her expression carried a mixture of hope and lingering apprehension. Tonight, then, though I would ask that we move with every possible caution, child. We have come too far, sacrificed too much, to lose everything now, through simple carelessness in these final steps. As darkness settled fully over the surrounding hills, the three of them prepared for the final leg of a journey that had begun nearly a week earlier with desperate flight through the hollow wood, and now, finally, approached its crucial culmination within the very chapel where Grace had likely been christened as an infant, beneath a stone marker that had silently guarded her mother's final act of protection for 19 long years. They waited until well past midnight before finally setting out from the shepherd's hut, moving carefully through the darkened hills toward Ashbourne, Agnes leading the way along paths she knew intimately from a lifetime spent in these surroundings. The village, when it finally came into view below them, looked deceptively peaceful in the moonlight, most windows dark, only the occasional flicker of a lantern marking the presence of soldiers still stationed at various points throughout the settlement. The chapel lies just beyond that far cluster of trees, Agnes whispered, pointing toward a shadowed structure barely visible at the village's edge. We will need to circle around through the old orchard to avoid the main square entirely, where I believe at least a handful of soldiers remain stationed even at this late hour. They moved slowly and carefully, keeping to whatever shadow and cover the landscape offered, and Grace found her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation as they drew steadily closer to the small stone chapel, where her mother had once, apparently, entrusted the kingdom's most dangerous secret to the care of consecrated ground. They reached the chapel's outer wall without incident, and Agnes led them to a small side door, its lock rusted with age but still functional, requiring several minutes of careful, quiet work before it finally yielded. Inside, the chapel's interior lay shrouded in darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through narrow windows set high along the walls, illuminating rows of simple wooden pews and a modest stone altar at the far end. The graves lie beneath the floor at the rear of the chapel, Agnes explained quietly, leading them past the altar toward a section of stone flooring marked with simple carved names and dates, the resting places of parish servants who had faithfully served this small community across many generations. Your mother mentioned once in passing a particular grave she found peaceful, though I never understood at the time why she spoke of it with such careful, deliberate attention. She knelt beside one particular stone, weathered and worn, but still legible in the dim light, bearing the name of a woman who had apparently served as the chapel's caretaker some decades past. Grace knelt beside her, running her fingers over the stone's carved surface, searching for any sign of the hidden mechanism the brass key might be meant to unlock. It was Edward who finally noticed the small, nearly invisible seam along the stone's edge, barely distinguishable from ordinary weathering, unless one already knew to search for it. Here, he said quietly, tracing the seam with careful fingers. This stone appears to be set differently from the others, as though designed to be lifted, rather than permanently fixed in place. Grace withdrew the brass key from where she had carried it faithfully throughout her entire journey, and searched the stone's surface for any keyhole or mechanism that might correspond to it. She found it finally, cleverly disguised within the carved lettering of the caretaker's name, a small metal fitting, nearly invisible, unless examined at exactly the right angle. Her hands trembled as she inserted the key, feeling it turn with a soft, satisfying click that echoed faintly in the chapel's silent interior. The stone shifted slightly beneath her touch, and with Edward's help, they carefully lifted it away, revealing a small stone cavity beneath, dry and undisturbed, despite the passage of 19 years. Within lay a small, weathered wooden box, and Grace lifted it carefully from its hiding place, her hands shaking with a mixture of exhaustion, hope, and overwhelming emotion. She opened the box slowly, finding within a single folded document, its parchment yellowed with age, but still clearly legible, bearing at its base an unmistakable royal seal pressed into dark red wax. "It is here," she breathed, hardly daring to speak above a whisper. "After everything, it is truly here." She unfolded the document carefully, and by the faint moonlight filtering through the chapel's windows, began to read the careful, formal language that would, if presented properly before the full Council of Lords, finally reveal the truth her mother had died protecting, the truth that had sent 10,000 soldiers marching across the kingdom in a desperate attempt to ensure it never saw the light of day. The decree, in Edmund's own formal hand, acknowledged Eowyn as his true-born daughter, entitled by blood to stand among the legitimate claimants to the throne, should the direct royal line ever fail to produce another heir. It named witnesses, long since scattered or silenced, who could attest to its authenticity, and it bore, unmistakably, the personal seal that no forger could easily replicate, the same seal that had marked every formal proclamation issued during Edmund's 30-year reign. "We have it," Grace said, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, as the full weight of everything her mother had sacrificed, everything Agnes had protected, everything Nora and Cuthbert had risked, finally crystallized into this single, tangible proof held trembling in her hands. "After everything, we finally have it." Agnes embraced her tightly, her own eyes bright with unshed tears, while Edward stood watch near the chapel's entrance, his expression a careful mixture of relief and continued vigilance, aware that possessing the decree, however significant, represented only the beginning of a far more dangerous challenge still to come. "We should not linger here," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "However significant this discovery, we remain in considerable danger, so long as we linger anywhere near Ashbourne itself. We must find a way to carry this proof, somewhere it can be properly presented, somewhere Blackwood's reach cannot simply silence it, before it ever receives the hearing it deserves." Grace nodded, carefully refolding the precious document and returning it to its protective box, tucking it securely within her shawl, alongside the cloth bearing her true name that had started this entire journey. "Then we find such a place," she said, her voice steadying with renewed determination despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. "Whatever it takes, wherever we must go, we carry this truth forward until it finally reaches those with the power to act upon it." They slipped back out of the chapel as quietly as they had entered, resealing the empty stone behind them, out of some instinctive respect for the sacred ground that had guarded their secret for so many years, and made their way back through the darkened orchard toward the hills beyond Ashbourne, carrying with them, finally, the proof that Grace's mother had given her life to protect, and that Blackwood had mobilized an entire kingdom's military might in a desperate attempt to ensure never came to light. Behind them, unknown to any of the three, a soldier stationed near the village's edge had noticed movement near the old chapel sometime after midnight, and was even now making his way toward his commanding officer to report what he had witnessed, setting into motion a chain of events that would, within hours, transform Blackwood's already massive search into something far more desperate and dangerous still. The soldier's report reached his commanding officer within the hour, and by dawn, a rider had already been dispatched northward toward the capital, carrying word that movement had been observed near Ashbourne's parish chapel in the dead of night, movement that matched no ordinary explanation given how thoroughly the village itself remained under watch. The message reached Blackwood himself By mid-afternoon of the following day, and the fury that had been steadily building within him across nearly a week of failed searches finally found its full, terrible expression. "They have found it," he said quietly, reading the report a second time, as though hoping the words might somehow rearrange themselves into a less alarming conclusion. Whatever they sought, whatever knowledge Cuthbert or that healer, or anyone else along her path might have provided, they have found it in Ashbourne itself, likely hidden there by Isolde before her death. Osric, standing before his desk with carefully composed patience, chose his next words with evident caution. "We do not know with certainty what was discovered, my lord. The soldier reported only movement near the chapel, nothing more definitive." "I know enough," Blackwood said, his voice carrying a coldness that made even Osric, accustomed to his master's temper after years of faithful service, shift uncomfortably. "I know that a woman with a legitimate claim to my throne has now likely secured proof of that claim, proof bearing my uncle's own seal, proof that no council in this kingdom could easily dismiss once properly presented. I know that every day she remains free brings her closer to finding someone willing to champion that claim before the very lords whose support I have spent 2 years carefully securing." He rose from his desk, moving to the window with the same restless energy that had marked their previous conversation a week earlier, though now that energy carried a sharper, more desperate edge. 10,000 men have proven insufficient, it seems. Very well, we will not make the same mistake twice. "My lord?" Osric asked carefully, sensing the shift in his master's intention, even before it had been fully spoken. "I want every available soldier in the northern provinces mobilized immediately," Blackwood said, turning back from the window with an expression of grim, final determination. "Not merely the columns already deployed, but every garrison, every reserve force, every man capable of holding a weapon and following orders. I want checkpoints on every road, every bridge, every crossing point between here and the southern border. I want every village between Ashbourne and the capital searched house by house, and I want it done within the week." "That would require nearly the entire standing army," Osric said, his careful composure finally cracking slightly under the evident magnitude of what Blackwood proposed. "The council will demand explanation for such an unprecedented mobilization, whatever cover story we offer them about bandits and unpaid taxes. 20,000 men, perhaps more, cannot simply vanish from their ordinary garrison duties without raising serious questions." "Then let them ask their questions," Blackwood said flatly. "I will answer them however necessary, invent whatever justification proves sufficiently convincing, but I will not allow this woman to reach anyone capable of championing her claim before I have secured her, and whatever proof she now carries, once and for all. This ends now, Osric. Whatever it costs, whatever explanation I must eventually offer, this ends now." Within days, the full weight of Blackwood's mobilization became apparent across the northern provinces, transforming what had already been a substantial military presence into something approaching outright occupation. Soldiers appeared at every crossroads, every market town, every village of even modest size, their numbers so overwhelming that ordinary travel became nearly impossible without passing through some form of formal checkpoint or inspection. Grace, Edward, and Agnes, sheltering in a series of increasingly cautious hiding places as they attempted to determine some safe route toward the capital, found their options narrowing with alarming speed as the days passed. What had once been a difficult but manageable evasion of scattered search parties had transformed into something far more desperate. A landscape saturated with soldiers determined to leave no possible avenue of escape unwatched. "We cannot continue moving so openly," Edward said, as they huddled together in a shallow cave some distance from the main roads, having narrowly avoided a patrol that had passed within mere yards of their hiding place only an hour earlier. "Blackwood has committed everything to this search, it seems. Every road we might reasonably take toward the capital appears watched with a thoroughness I have never witnessed, even during the most tense periods of his early consolidation of power." "Then how do we proceed?" Grace asked, exhaustion and fear mixing in equal measure within her voice. "We cannot simply remain hidden indefinitely, not while this proof remains unpresented, and Blackwood's search grows more desperate with every passing day." Agnes, who had remained largely quiet during their increasingly frequent discussions of strategy, finally spoke, her weathered expression thoughtful, despite the evident strain of their situation. "There is one possibility we have not yet considered," she said slowly. "A name I have not spoken in many years, though I believe he may yet remain sympathetic to the cause your mother once served." "Who?" Grace asked, leaning forward with renewed attention. "General Alden Marrow," Agnes said. "He served as Edmund's most trusted military commander for nearly 2 decades, and by all accounts I have heard across the years, never fully reconciled himself to Blackwood's rise to power. He retired from active service shortly after Edmund's death, officially due to his advancing age, though I have always suspected the timing carried rather less innocent explanation. He maintains an estate somewhere in the southern hills, well beyond the current reach of Blackwood's northern mobilization, and commands considerable respect among certain factions of the military who remember his leadership fondly." Edward's expression brightened slightly at this suggestion. "I served briefly under his command myself, years ago, before his retirement. He struck me as a man of genuine principle, uncommon among the officers who rose to prominence during Edmund's later reign. If he retains sympathy for the legitimate succession and sufficient influence among those still serving in the military, he may represent exactly the kind of ally we need." "But his estate lies to the south," Grace said, calculating the distance in her mind with growing apprehension, "which means crossing through territory that Blackwood's mobilization has not yet fully saturated, but which nonetheless requires us to pass through or near the very regions where his search remains most concentrated." "It is a considerable risk," Agnes acknowledged, "but I confess, I see no safer alternative remaining to us. We cannot simply wait here indefinitely, hoping the search somehow loses momentum on its own. Every day increases the likelihood of eventual discovery, wherever we choose to hide." They spent the remainder of that day debating the safest possible route southward, Edward drawing rough maps in the dirt floor of their small cave, marking known checkpoints, and search areas based on what fragments of information they had gathered from cautious conversations with sympathetic villagers along their journey thus far. The picture that emerged was daunting, a landscape increasingly dominated by Blackwood's soldiers, with only a handful of possible routes offering any reasonable hope of passage without discovery. "We will need to move mostly by night," Edward finally concluded, "and rely heavily on whatever local knowledge we can gather from sympathetic contacts along the way. It will be slow, dangerous work, but I see no faster alternative that does not risk immediate discovery." Grace nodded, drawing what strength she could from the determination evident in both her companion's expressions, though privately, she felt the weight of everything now resting upon their success pressing down with fresh, overwhelming intensity. Somewhere behind them, an entire kingdom's military apparatus had been turned loose in pursuit of a single young woman, and the proof she now carried. A scale of pursuit that seemed almost impossible to comprehend, let alone successfully evade. "We should rest while we can," Agnes suggested gently, noting the evident exhaustion weighing upon both younger members of their small group. "Tomorrow night, we begin the journey south, toward whatever hope General Marrow's estate might offer us. Tonight, we gather what strength remains to us for the trials still ahead." As darkness settled fully over their hidden cave, Grace found sleep elusive, despite her profound exhaustion, her mind circling endlessly around the enormity of what now stood between herself and any hope of safely presenting the truth she carried. 10,000 soldiers had become 20,000, perhaps more, an entire kingdom's military might arrayed against her, all because a dying king had loved her enough, 19 years past, to ensure that his blood and his throne might one day pass rightfully to the daughter he could never openly acknowledge. She thought of her mother's sacrifice, of Agnes's 19 years of careful, guarded protection, of Nora's courage in Thornfield, of Cuthbert's steadfast silence under questioning, of Edward's unwavering loyalty throughout every mile of their increasingly dangerous journey. Each of them had risked everything to bring her to this moment, and she understood, with growing clarity, that she owed it to every one of them to see this final, desperate journey through to whatever conclusion awaited, however overwhelming the forces now arrayed against her success. Tomorrow, they would begin the most dangerous leg of their journey yet, moving southward through a landscape saturated with soldiers, determined to find and silence her before she ever reached anyone capable of championing the truth she carried. Whatever awaited them on that road, Grace understood that there could be no turning back now, not after everything already sacrificed, not after coming so impossibly close to finally securing the justice her mother had died attempting to protect. They set out the following night exactly as planned, moving south under cover of darkness, along paths Edward selected with careful attention, to avoiding the checkpoints they had mapped the previous day. Progress proved painfully slow, each mile requiring careful assessment of the surrounding terrain, frequent pauses to listen for any sign of patrol activity, and constant readjustment of their route whenever unexpected obstacles or dangers presented themselves. By the third night of their southward journey, they had covered barely a quarter of the distance Edward estimated separated them from General Marrow's estate, and the strain of constant vigilance had begun taking a visible toll on all three travelers. Grace found herself moving through a kind of exhausted haze, placing one foot before the other, largely through sheer determination, rather than any remaining physical reserve, while even Edward's normally steady composure showed signs of fraying under the relentless pressure of their situation. It was during this third night that they encountered their most serious challenge yet, rounding a bend in a narrow forest path, only to find themselves suddenly and unexpectedly within sight of a checkpoint they had not anticipated. Soldiers stationed at a crossing point, where the path intersected with a small but apparently significant road Edward had not accounted for in his earlier planning. They froze immediately, pressing back into the shadow of the surrounding trees, but not quickly enough to entirely avoid notice. A shout rose from the checkpoint, followed swiftly by the sound of soldiers moving to investigate, and Edward grabbed both Grace and Agnes, pulling them deeper into the forest, away from the path entirely, moving with the swift, decisive urgency of someone who understood exactly how narrow their margin for error had suddenly become. "This way," he hissed, leading them through dense undergrowth that tore at their clothes and skin, moving as quickly as the difficult terrain allowed, while the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer behind them. Grace's lungs burned with the effort of running, while already exhausted from days of careful, cautious travel, but she forced herself onward, understanding with complete clarity that capture now, so close to potential safety, would undo everything they had sacrificed to achieve thus far. They ran for what felt like an eternity, the sounds of pursuit sometimes fading, sometimes drawing alarmingly close, until Edward finally led them into a narrow ravine, its steep walls offering at least temporary shelter from direct pursuit, while a small stream at its base provided cover for the sound of their labored breathing. "We cannot outrun them indefinitely," Agnes gasped, her advanced age making the strain of their flight particularly evident, despite her evident determination not to slow their progress, not if they maintain organized pursuit through terrain this difficult. Edward's expression, even in the dim moonlight filtering into the ravine, carried grim calculation. "There is a narrow passage further along this ravine that leads eventually to a series of caves, I recall from an earlier journey through this region. If we can reach them before the soldiers organize a more thorough search, we may yet find safe shelter until they abandon this particular pursuit." They pressed onward, following the ravine's winding course deeper into terrain that grew increasingly treacherous, until finally, just as the sounds of pursuit seemed to be drawing dangerously close once more, Edward located the cave entrance he sought, barely visible behind a curtain of hanging vines that had grown thick enough to conceal it from all but the most careful examination. They slipped inside just as torchlight became visible at the ravine's entrance behind them, and Edward quickly arranged the vines to conceal any evidence of their passage, gesturing urgently for silence as they retreated deeper into the cave's dark interior. For long, agonizing minutes, they listened to the sounds of soldiers searching the ravine outside, voices calling back and forth, the crunch of boots on loose stone growing closer, and then, gradually, more distant as the search apparently moved past their hidden position. It was nearly an hour before Edward finally judged it safe enough to speak in more than a whisper, and even then, his voice carried careful restraint. "I believe they have moved on, for now, though we should remain here until well past dawn, to ensure they have genuinely abandoned this particular search before we risk moving again." Grace sank against the cave's rough stone wall, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and the lingering aftermath of fear, and felt Agnes settle beside her, the old woman's arm wrapping protectively around her shoulders, despite her own evident weariness. "We came so close to capture," Grace said quietly, once her breathing had finally steadied. "If Edward had not known of this cave, if we had been even slightly slower reaching it." "But we were not slower," Agnes said firmly, cutting off the spiral of anxious speculation before it could fully take hold. "We reached safety, child, through skill and careful preparation, and no small measure of good fortune. Dwelling on what might have happened serves little purpose beyond exhausting spirits, already stretched thin enough by what did happen." Edward, keeping careful watch near the cave's concealed entrance, added his own measured reassurance. "We have proven, across nearly 2 weeks of continuous pursuit, that we can evade even Blackwood's most determined efforts, provided we remain careful and make use of whatever advantages the terrain and local knowledge offer us." Tonight's near encounter was frightening, certainly, but it does not represent failure. It represents simply one more obstacle successfully overcome. Grace found some measure of comfort in his words, though the exhaustion and strain of their situation continued weighing heavily upon her as the night wore on. She thought again of everyone who had sacrificed and risked so much to bring her this far, and renewed her private determination to see this journey through, to whatever conclusion awaited, however difficult the path still ahead might prove. As dawn finally began to lighten the cave's concealed entrance, Edward cautiously ventured out to survey the surrounding terrain, returning after a tense quarter hour with cautiously encouraging news. The soldiers appear to have withdrawn entirely from this immediate area, likely assuming we escaped in some other direction during the night. We should have at least a few hours of relative safety before any renewed search might reasonably extend back toward this position. They used those precious hours to rest as thoroughly as their circumstances allowed, sharing what little food remained in their diminishing supplies, before finally resuming their careful southward journey as the following night descended once more over the increasingly dangerous landscape they continued to navigate. Ahead of them, still several days distant, waited General Marrow's estate, and whatever hope his sympathy toward the true succession might offer, against the overwhelming force Blackwood had now committed entirely to ensuring their final, desperate journey never reached its intended conclusion. 6 more days passed in a grueling rhythm of careful night travel and anxious daytime hiding before General Marrow's estate finally came into view, a substantial stone manor house set amid rolling farmland that showed considerably less evidence of Blackwood's military saturation than the northern provinces they had so recently escaped. Grace felt a cautious flicker of hope at the sight, though exhaustion and the accumulated strain of their journey had worn her down to something closer to grim, mechanical determination than genuine optimism. "We should approach carefully, regardless," Edward cautioned, as they paused at the edge of the estate's outer fields, studying the manor house for any sign of unusual activity. "Even here we cannot assume complete safety. Marrow's sympathies, whatever they once were, may have shifted in the 2 years since his retirement, and we have no way of confirming his continued loyalty to the true succession beyond Agnes's recollection of rumors, now some years old." They approached the manor's servants' entrance rather than the main door, and Agnes, drawing on some reserve of authority that Grace had not fully witnessed before, requested an audience with the general himself, claiming urgent business that could be explained only in person. The servant who received them studied their travel-worn appearance with evident skepticism, but something in Agnes's manner apparently convinced him to at least relay the request, and after a tense quarter hour of waiting in a small servant's antechamber, they were finally led through the manor's quiet halls toward a private study where General Marrow himself awaited them. He proved to be an older man, his bearing still carrying the unmistakable discipline of decades spent in military command, despite his evident age, his sharp eyes studying each of them in turn, with careful, assessing attention as they entered his study. "You claim urgent business," he said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone long accustomed to command. "I confess I receive few visitors these days who arrive in such evident distress, nor who request audience with such careful insistence on privacy. Speak plainly. What business brings you to my door?" Grace stepped forward, drawing on whatever strength remained to her after weeks of continuous flight, and withdrew the precious box containing the decree from within her shawl. "My name is Elowen," she said, watching carefully for any reaction the name might produce. "Daughter of King Edmund, and a seamstress named Isolde, who died protecting the proof of my birthright from those who would see it destroyed. Merrow's expression shifted through several stages of surprise and careful calculation as she spoke, his eyes moving from her face to the box in her hands with evident, dawning understanding. Isolde's daughter, he repeated slowly. I had heard whispers some years past of a child born to the king outside his formal marriage, though I confess, I had assumed such rumors either false or long since resolved through less public means. You claim to carry proof of this birthright. Grace opened the box carefully, withdrawing the decree and presenting it to him with hands that trembled slightly, despite her best efforts at composure. Merrow accepted it with evident care, studying the document closely, his weathered face carrying an expression that grew steadily more serious as he read through its formal language and finally examined the royal seal pressed into the aged wax at its base. This seal, he said finally, looking up from the document with an intensity that made Grace's heart pound with renewed hope, is genuine, unless forged with a skill I have never before witnessed. I served alongside Edmund for nearly 20 years, and I know his personal seal, as well as I know my own hand. He set the document down carefully on his desk, his expression grave. Do you understand fully what you carry, young woman? This document, properly presented and verified, could shake the very foundations of Blackwood's rule. I understand, Grace said firmly. I have understood for weeks now, ever since I first learned the truth of my own birth, and I have watched an entire kingdom's military might turned loose in pursuit of ensuring this truth never reaches those with power to act upon it. I have come to you because I have been told you retain sympathy for the legitimate succession and influence among those who might yet be willing to act upon that sympathy. Merrow studied her for a long, silent moment, and Grace found herself holding her breath, acutely aware of how much now rested upon his response. Finally, he rose from behind his desk, moving to a window that offered a view across his quiet, peaceful estate, his expression carrying the weight of careful, difficult calculation. I retired from active service, he said slowly, because I could no longer, in good conscience, continue serving a man I believed had murdered his way to a throne he had no rightful claim to hold. I have watched, these past 2 years, as Blackwood consolidated his power through fear and careful political maneuvering, and I have wondered, more than once, whether I might have done more to oppose his rise, had I possessed proof sufficient to challenge him openly rather than mere suspicion and private conviction. He turned back from the window, his expression settling into something resembling grim resolve. You have brought me that proof now, it seems, though the timing carries its own dangers. Blackwood's military mobilization has grown so extensive these past weeks that even here, in the southern provinces, we have received reports of soldiers appearing in numbers rarely seen outside times of genuine war. Whatever we choose to do with this proof, we must act quickly and carefully, before his search extends fully into this region as well. What do you propose? Edward asked, speaking for the first time since their arrival, his tone carrying the careful respect of a former soldier, addressing a commander he clearly still held in high regard. Merrow considered the question seriously before responding. There exists a gathering of lords scheduled to convene at Castleford, some 3 days' journey from here, ostensibly to discuss matters of regional taxation and border security. Many among those attending have long harbored private doubts about Blackwood's legitimacy, doubts they have kept carefully hidden simply because no viable alternative has ever presented itself to challenge his rule. If we can reach that gathering and present this proof before the assembled lords directly, we may yet turn the tide against him before his search can prevent it. 3 days, Grace repeated, calculating the risk, even as hope flared cautiously within her chest. 3 days of travel through territory that may yet fall under Blackwood's search, carrying proof that represents everything he has committed his entire military strength to destroying. A considerable risk, Merrow acknowledged, but I see no safer alternative remaining to us, given how thoroughly his search has already spread across the kingdom. Waiting longer only increases the danger of eventual discovery, wherever we might choose to hide in the meantime. Better, I think, to act decisively now, while we still possess the element of surprise regarding both the proof itself and our intention to present it before the gathered lords. He moved to his desk, drawing parchment and beginning to compose what Grace assumed were messages to be sent ahead, to contacts among the gathering lords, his manner shifting into the brisk, efficient competence of a man long accustomed to organizing complex undertakings on short notice. I will accompany you myself to Castleford, along with whatever loyal men I can gather from among my former officers who still maintain residence in this region. We will need every advantage of numbers and reputation we can muster. Given the desperate opposition, Blackwood will surely mount once he learns of our intention. Grace felt a fresh surge of hope at this commitment, though it came tempered by renewed awareness of the danger still facing them. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to fully articulate the depth of gratitude she felt toward this man, who had, within a single conversation, transformed their desperate flight into something approaching genuine possibility of success. "Do not thank me yet," Marrow said grimly, continuing his careful preparations. "We have 3 days of dangerous travel ahead of us, and a confrontation at its end that may prove more perilous still. Whatever gratitude you wish to offer, save it for the day this proof finally secures the justice your mother sacrificed her life attempting to achieve." They spent that evening in careful preparation, Marrow gathering a small but capable group of loyal former soldiers willing to risk everything on this final, desperate gambit, while Grace, Edward, and Agnes rested as thoroughly as their circumstances allowed, gathering strength for whatever trials the coming days might bring. As darkness settled over the peaceful southern estate, Grace found herself thinking, with mixture of hope and lingering apprehension, of the gathering at Castleford that now represented their best and perhaps only remaining chance to finally present the truth she carried before those with genuine power to act upon it, and to end, once and for all, the desperate pursuit that had defined nearly every waking moment of her life since that terrible first night in Ashbourne. They set out for Castleford at first light, a party now grown to nearly a dozen, Marrow's loyal former officers providing both additional protection and a reassuring sense of organized purpose that had been largely absent from their journey thus far. Grace found herself grateful for the change, though the weight of what awaited at their destination continued pressing upon her with every mile they traveled. The first 2 days passed with relatively little incident, Marrow's local knowledge and careful planning allowing them to avoid the worst of the search parties still combing the countryside, though reports reaching them from sympathetic contacts along the way painted an increasingly alarming picture of Blackwood's continued mobilization. Word had apparently reached the capital of unusual activity near Ashbourne, and subsequent reports of a substantial party moving south from General Marrow's estate had evidently triggered fresh alarm among Blackwood's commanders, who had begun redirecting significant forces toward the southern provinces in response. It was on the 3rd day, as they approached within a few hours' journey of Castleford itself, that their carefully planned route finally encountered serious difficulty. A scout Marrow had sent ahead returned with grim news, reporting a substantial military checkpoint established directly across the main road leading into the town, apparently anticipating exactly the kind of approach they had planned. "They know we are coming," Marrow said grimly, studying the scout's report with evident concern. "Or at least, they suspect enough to establish a checkpoint capable of intercepting any party matching our description. We cannot simply approach through the main road as originally intended." "Is there another route?" Grace asked, fighting to keep the rising panic from her voice, as this fresh obstacle threatened to undo weeks of careful, desperate effort. Marrow considered the question with the careful calculation of an experienced military commander assessing difficult terrain. "There is a smaller path, used mostly by local farmers moving goods to Castleford's market, that approaches from the eastern side of town rather than the main northern road. It is narrower, and offers less room for our full party to move quickly, but it should avoid the checkpoint entirely, provided Blackwood's forces have not yet extended their watch to cover every possible approach." They shifted their route accordingly, moving with renewed urgency now that the immediate proximity of their destination had apparently triggered heightened vigilance from Blackwood's forces. The eastern path proved as narrow and difficult as Marrow had warned, forcing their party to move in a single-file line through terrain that offered little room for the kind of organized defense their numbers might otherwise have provided. They were perhaps an hour from Castleford's outer boundary when disaster finally struck. A sudden ambush from soldiers concealed among the dense hedgerows lining the narrow path, their presence apparently anticipating exactly the alternative route Marrow's party had chosen. Chaos erupted immediately, shouts and the clash of weapons filling the narrow passage as Marrow's former officers moved swiftly to defend their vulnerable position. "Grace with me," Edward shouted, pulling her away from the main confrontation while Marrow's men engaged the ambushing soldiers, buying precious time for their escape. Agnes followed close behind, her earlier calm replaced by evident fear as they scrambled through a gap in the hedgerow, away from the fighting, toward whatever alternative path might still offer escape. They had covered perhaps 100 yards when Grace realized, with sudden horror, that Agnes had fallen behind, her advanced age finally proving too great a burden for the desperate pace their flight demanded. She turned back instinctively, but Edward caught her arm, his expression carrying grim, urgent necessity. "We cannot stop," he said, though his own voice carried clear reluctance at the words he was forced to speak. "Marrow's men will protect her as best they can. Our priority must be reaching Castleford with the proof itself, whatever the cost." Grace felt something within her rebel fiercely against this logic, every instinct screaming at her to return for the woman who had raised and protected her for 19 years. But she understood, even through her fear and reluctance, the terrible calculation Edward's words represented. The decree mattered more than any single life, even one as precious to her as Agnes's, because only its successful presentation could ensure that everyone's sacrifice, including whatever price Agnes might now pay, ultimately achieved its intended purpose. "Go." Agnes's voice reached them from somewhere behind, carrying surprising strength despite her evident exhaustion. "I will manage, child. Reach Castleford. Finish what your mother began." Grace forced herself forward, tears streaming freely down her face now, as she and Edward continued their desperate flight toward Castleford, the sounds of continued fighting gradually fading behind them as they put distance between themselves and the ambush site. She did not know, in that terrible moment, whether Agnes would survive the encounter, whether Marrow's men would successfully hold back the ambushing soldiers, or whether this final, desperate dash toward Castleford would prove worth the terrible price apparently being paid to make it possible. They reached the outskirts of Castleford as afternoon light began to soften toward evening. Breathless and exhausted, the sounds of fighting entirely faded into the distance behind them. Edward paused only briefly to get his bearings, before leading them toward the town's central square, where, according to Marrow's earlier information, the gathering of lords was scheduled to convene that very evening. "We must reach the gathering directly," Edward said, his own voice tight with barely controlled urgency despite his evident exhaustion. "Whatever has happened behind us, we cannot allow it to have been in vain. The proof must be presented, tonight, before Blackwood's forces can somehow prevent it." Grace nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks with a trembling hand, and forced herself forward despite the overwhelming weight of grief and uncertainty pressing down upon her. Whatever price had been paid on that narrow path behind them, whatever fate had befallen Agnes and Marrow's brave officers, she understood with complete, terrible clarity that she now carried a responsibility that extended far beyond her own survival, a responsibility to ensure that every sacrifice made across these desperate weeks, from her mother's death 19 years past to whatever had just occurred on the road behind her, ultimately achieved the justice they had all fought so desperately to secure. The gathering hall came into view ahead, grand stone architecture rising above the surrounding buildings, lantern light spilling from its tall windows into the gathering evening darkness, and Grace felt her heart pound with a mixture of desperate hope and profound uncertainty as she and Edward approached its imposing entrance, carrying between them the final proof that might yet turn the tide against everything Blackwood had committed his entire reign to protecting. The gathering hall's main doors stood open, guards posted at the entrance who eyed Grace and Edward's travel-worn, disheveled appearance with evident suspicion as they approached. Edward stepped forward quickly, drawing on whatever remaining authority his former service might still command. "We carry urgent business for the assembled lords," he said firmly, "a matter concerning the legitimate succession of the crown itself. I ask that you allow us entrance, or at minimum, that you carry word of our presence to General Marrow, who should already be known to several among the gathering." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unaccustomed to such dramatic claims delivered by such unlikely messengers, but something in Edward's evident conviction, combined with the mention of Marrow's name, apparently proved sufficient to warrant caution rather than immediate dismissal. One guard disappeared into the hall, while the other maintained careful watch over the two exhausted travelers, and after several tense minutes, a formally dressed steward emerged, studying them both with careful, assessing attention. "You claim business concerning the succession itself," the steward said slowly. "That is a serious claim to bring before this gathering, particularly delivered in such unusual circumstances. I must ask you to explain yourselves further before I can consider granting entrance to such an important assembly." Grace stepped forward, drawing the wooden box from within her shawl with hands that trembled from exhaustion rather than fear. "My name is Elowen," she said, her voice carrying more strength than she felt, drawing on some final reserve of determination after everything sacrificed to reach this moment. "Daughter of King Edmund, and I carry proof of my birthright, sealed with his own hand, that I ask to present before the assembled lords this very evening." The steward's expression shifted through evident shock and careful calculation as her words registered fully. "Such a claim, if genuine, carries implications far beyond what I am authorized to simply grant or deny access based upon. Wait here. I will consult with those lords already gathered, regarding how best to proceed." He disappeared once more into the hall, and Grace felt the weight of uncertain waiting pressing upon her with fresh intensity, every passing minute carrying the risk that Blackwood's forces, wherever they now stood following the ambush on the road behind them, might yet arrive to prevent this final, crucial presentation before it could properly occur. It was General Marrow himself who finally emerged from the hall, his clothing torn and bearing evidence of the fighting they had left behind, but his expression carrying grim, triumphant relief at the sight of Grace and Edward still standing at the entrance. "You made it," he said, relief evident in his voice despite his obvious exhaustion. "We held the ambush long enough to ensure your escape, though it cost us dearly. 2 of my officers fell defending our retreat, and Agnes—" He paused, his expression carrying genuine sorrow. "She was wounded, but alive when I last saw her, being carried by one of my remaining men toward whatever medical assistance we could find in the countryside. I could not remain to ensure her full safety without risking our entire purpose here tonight." Grace felt fresh tears threatening at this news, relief and continued fear warring within her chest. But she forced herself to focus on the immediate task still before them. Then we must ensure her sacrifice, and everyone else's, was not made in vain, she said, her voice steadying with renewed resolve. "Can you gain us entrance to present this proof tonight?" Marrow nodded firmly. "The gathered lords have agreed to hear your claim, though I must warn you, several among them remain uncertain how to respond to such an unprecedented presentation. Come, we have little time to waste, given everything that has already occurred this evening." They followed him into the grand hall, where dozens of richly dressed lords sat gathered around a long formal table, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical as the disheveled trio entered their midst. Grace felt every eye in the room settle upon her as she approached the table's head, where an elderly lord with silver hair and sharp, evaluating eyes apparently held the position of presiding authority over this particular gathering. "You claim to be King Edmund's true-born daughter," the presiding lord said, his tone carrying careful neutrality rather than either open hostility or ready acceptance. "A remarkable claim, delivered under remarkable circumstances. I trust you carry proof sufficient to justify such a dramatic presentation before this assembly." Grace opened the box with trembling hands, withdrawing the precious decree and presenting it formally before the gathered lords. "This document bears my father's personal seal and was drafted by his own trusted scribe, Brother Cuthbert, who now resides at the Abbey of St. Serwyn and can attest to its authenticity should this assembly require further verification. It names me as a legitimate claimant to the succession, should the direct royal line ever fail to produce another heir, which, as this assembly well knows, it never did beyond myself." The presiding lord accepted the document with careful, deliberate attention, studying its formal language, and the royal seal pressed into its aged wax with the practiced eye of someone long accustomed to evaluating official proclamations. As he read, murmurs began spreading among the other assembled lords, some leaning forward with evident interest, others exchanging worried glances that suggested private calculations regarding what such a revelation might mean for their own carefully maintained positions under Blackwood's rule. "This seal appears genuine," the presiding lord finally announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent hall. Though such a claim, if formally recognized, carries implications that this assembly cannot simply resolve on its own authority in a single evening. This matter requires proper formal review, testimony from witnesses such as the scribe you have mentioned, and careful consideration by the full council, rather than this smaller regional gathering. Before Grace could respond to this cautious, measured response, the hall's main doors burst open with sudden, violent force, and a company of soldiers marched in, their leader immediately recognizable by his bearing and the fine quality of his dark cloak, even before he spoke a single word. "Lord Blackwood," the presiding lord said, rising slowly from his seat, his expression carefully neutral despite the evident tension now filling the hall. "This is an unexpected arrival, particularly given the private nature of this gathering." "I have received word," Blackwood said, his voice carrying cold, controlled fury as his eyes settled immediately upon Grace, "that a fugitive from justice has sought to disrupt this lawful assembly with false claims against the Crown's legitimate authority. I have come to correct this unfortunate interruption and to ensure that proper order is restored to these proceedings. The document she carries bears your uncle's seal," the presiding lord said carefully, gesturing toward the decree still resting on the table before him. "A matter of some significance, I would think, regardless of whatever other claims you wish to bring against her." Blackwood's expression flickered with something that might have been fear beneath its carefully maintained mask of authority, but his voice remained steady as he responded. "Forgeries can be crafted with remarkable skill by those desperate enough to pursue treason against the Crown. I would advise this assembly against granting such a document any credibility without far more rigorous verification than a single evening's hasty presentation can provide." "Then verify it," Grace said, stepping forward with a boldness she had not fully expected to summon, given the exhaustion and fear that had defined nearly every moment of her journey thus far. "Send for Brother Cuthbert, who drafted this very document at your uncle's own instruction. Send for anyone among your own household who might recall the details of my mother's service at court, or the circumstances surrounding my birth. I have nothing to hide, and everything to gain from whatever thorough investigation this assembly wishes to conduct. Can you say the same, Lord Blackwood, regarding the circumstances surrounding your own uncle's sudden illness, or your brother's convenient hunting accident, so shortly before you claimed this throne for yourself?" A sharp silence fell across the hall at these words, the assembled lords exchanging startled glances at such a direct, public accusation delivered before their entire gathering. Blackwood's expression darkened considerably, his careful composure finally showing genuine strain beneath the weight of Grace's pointed challenge. "You dare accuse me of such treachery," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "based on nothing more than the desperate fabrications of a fugitive seeking to escape justice for her own crimes against this Crown?" "I dare accuse you," Grace said, drawing on every reserve of courage and conviction that weeks of desperate flight and profound sacrifice had instilled within her, "because I have watched an entire kingdom's military might turned loose in pursuit of silencing me, a scale of pursuit that seems remarkably excessive for a simple fugitive of no particular significance. I dare accuse you because I have lost people I love in this desperate flight, people who sacrificed everything to see this truth finally presented before those with power to act upon it. Whatever proof you demand of my claim, I have provided it. What proof, Lord Blackwood, can you provide of your own legitimate right to the throne you currently occupy?" The presiding lord, watching this exchange with evident, careful calculation, finally spoke again, his voice carrying renewed authority as he addressed the gathered assembly. "This matter clearly requires far more thorough investigation than this evening allows, but I would suggest, given the seriousness of the claims now raised on both sides, that this assembly formally request the presence of Brother Cuthbert, along with any other relevant witnesses, before the full royal council within the fortnight. Until such investigation concludes, I would further suggest that no further action be taken against this young woman, given the legitimate proof she has presented this evening." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled lords, and Grace felt a fragile hope beginning to bloom within her chest as she watched the careful political calculation shifting visibly across the hall. lords who had perhaps long harbored private doubts about Blackwood's legitimacy finding, in her dramatic presentation, sufficient cause to finally voice those doubts openly. Blackwood's expression, watching this shift with evident, dawning alarm, finally cracked entirely, revealing beneath his carefully maintained composure something closer to genuine desperation. This assembly has no authority to simply dismiss the Crown's legitimate claim based on the fabrications of a common fugitive, he said, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. I will not stand for such treasonous suggestions, whatever proof this woman claims to carry. Then perhaps, the presiding lord said, his own voice carrying newfound steel beneath its careful formality, you should welcome the thorough investigation I have proposed, Lord Blackwood, if your own claim to this throne remains as legitimate as you insist. A ruler with nothing to hide should have nothing to fear from proper, careful verification of competing claims. The hall fell into tense, uncertain silence as Blackwood stood facing the assembled lords, his soldiers still positioned at the entrance behind him, the full weight of the moment's political calculation hanging precariously in the balance. Grace held her breath, watching this final, crucial confrontation unfold, understanding with complete clarity that everything her mother had sacrificed, everything Agnes had protected, everything Nora, Cuthbert, Edward, and General Marrow had risked across these desperate weeks, now rested upon whatever decision this assembly of lords finally reached. Finally, after a long, agonizing moment of silence, Blackwood's shoulders sagged slightly, some final calculation apparently concluding that open defiance before this gathered assembly, particularly given the soldiers he could see positioned throughout the hall belonging to lords whose loyalty he could no longer fully trust, offered less hope of success than a more measured, careful retreat. Very well, he said finally, his voice carrying bitter, controlled fury beneath its forced composure. Let this investigation proceed. If this assembly insists upon it, I have nothing to fear from the truth, whatever this woman claims otherwise. He turned and departed the hall with his soldiers, his composure carefully maintained, despite the evident weight of his retreat, and Grace felt the tension that had gripped her entire body finally beginning to ease, replaced by exhausted, disbelieving relief, as the hall slowly returned to more ordinary conversation around her. The investigation that followed, over the course of the following weeks, ultimately confirmed everything Grace had claimed, Brother Cuthbert's testimony before the full royal council, proving decisive in establishing both the decree's authenticity and the broader pattern of suspicious deaths that had cleared Blackwood's path to the throne. Faced with mounting evidence and rapidly eroding support among the very lords whose loyalty he had spent 2 years carefully cultivating, Blackwood ultimately fled the capital entirely, rather than face formal trial before the council, disappearing into exile in circumstances that would occupy court gossip for years to come. Agnes survived her wounds, recovering slowly under General Marrow's careful protection, before finally reuniting with Grace in the weeks following the pivotal gathering at Castleford, their joyful reunion carrying all the profound relief of a bond nearly severed by tragedy, but ultimately preserved through courage and sacrifice on both their parts. Nora, learning of the successful outcome through contacts along her traveling healer's circuit, sent word of her genuine joy, along with a promise to finally visit properly once circumstances allowed such a reunion. Grace herself, formally recognized by the Royal Council as Edmund's legitimate daughter, found herself navigating an entirely new life in the months that followed, one that carried both the privileges and profound responsibilities of her newly acknowledged royal bloodline. She insisted, against some resistance from more traditional members of the council, that Edward, Agnes, and General Marrow all receive proper recognition and reward for their crucial roles in securing the truth that had finally exposed Blackwood's illegitimate rule. In the years that followed, as Grace gradually assumed the responsibilities that her birthright now demanded of her, she often found herself reflecting upon the desperate flight that had begun with torches at her cottage door in Ashbourne, upon everyone who had sacrificed so much to bring her safely to this unexpected destiny. She kept the small brass key and the weathered cloth bearing her true name close throughout her life, tangible reminders of a mother's fierce, protective love that had ultimately triumphed over even the most overwhelming force a desperate king could muster against a single truth he could not bear to see revealed. The story of the seamstress's daughter who had evaded 10,000 soldiers, who had carried a dead king's secret safely through weeks of desperate flight, and who had ultimately claimed the justice her mother died protecting, became, in time, exactly the kind of legend passed down through generations that Grace herself had once heard as simple stories told by traveling merchants in her quiet village square, never imagining that she herself might one day become the subject of such tales, told and retold across a kingdom finally set right by the truth, carried faithfully in her blood.